Are you ready? Let your eyes gently close. Release the tension in your shoulders, that tight grip you've held onto all day, and pull the warm blanket right up to your chest. Tonight, we leave the noise and the worries of the present behind. We are going to let our minds drift back to a distant, freezing, yet infinitely quiet space. Imagine standing near the jagged peak of a towering mountain. The air up here is so thin, so devastatingly cold, that every breath you draw carries a sharp sting, settling deep into your lungs. It is the autumn of 218 BC. The Great Alps, Europe's massive natural fortress, are drowning in a thick, grey fog. There is no birdsong here, no gentle babbling of a stream. The only sound filling the void is the wind howling through sharp, jagged ravines, playing a mournful, desolate tune of the wild. But if you listen very closely, beneath the shrieking wind, another sound echoes. It doesn't belong here. It is the heavy, crunching thud of packed snow being crushed under an immense weight, followed by a labored, rhythmic panting. A thick plume of white steam shoots out from a long trunk, freezing almost the instant it touches the misty air. That is Surus, a colossal creature dragging his exhausted, heavy feet across the slick, treacherous ice. There is a heartbreaking irony in this picture. Surus was not built to endure the bone-chilling frost of the Alpine peaks. He is a bull elephant of the great Syrian breed, a species born beneath the scorching, blistering sun of the wild. His massive frame was designed to dissipate heat into dry, dusty winds, not to fight off blizzards. His thick, ash-gray skin, once accustomed to bathing in the red mud of sun-baked savannas, is now cracking and bleeding from the frost. One of his tusks was broken long ago, leaving a jagged scar that looks both proud and deeply weathered. Yet now, strapped to his broad back, is a heavy wooden tower, bolted with rusting iron plates and soaked leather straps. Most great empires are built on iron, blood, and the political calculations of men. But history books often forget that the crushing weight of those calculations usually falls upon the shoulders of innocent living things. Animals have no concept of borders. They do not know what Rome is. They do not understand why Carthage must emerge victorious. In Surus's primitive, quiet mind, the world is simply his herd, the cool shade of palm trees, the earthy scent of soil after a heavy downpour, and cold, fresh streams to quench a summer thirst. And yet, he was ripped away from that eternal peace, dragged into the vengeful spiral of a man named Hannibal Barca. Men call Hannibal a military genius, an undefeated commander with the ambition to move mountains. With a mere wave of his hand, tens of thousands of lives, thousands of horses, and 37 war elephants were forced onto an unprecedented journey, a path of no return. With your eyes closed, can you picture that suffocating contrast? Down below the mountain pass, thousands of foot soldiers shivering in thin cloaks, their teeth chattering violently. While up above, Surus, the largest, most powerful living creature of them all, feels his life slowly draining away. He doesn't understand why food has suddenly vanished. He doesn't understand why the ground beneath his feet is so white, so mercilessly cold. It is the pure confusion of a tiny soul trapped in a giant body, being ground down by the wheels of human history. History usually only records the triumphs of generals. But tonight, we will not glorify blood-soaked battlefields. We will step deep into the mind of Surus, listening to the slow, patient heartbeat of a giant trying to keep himself warm in a blizzard. Because sometimes true greatness is not about how many lands you conquer. It is about how you quietly keep walking, carrying the weight of an entire era on your back until there is no breath left. Let the Alpine wind slowly carry away the worries in your mind and return with Surus to the peaceful, sun-drenched savannas. Before the call of iron and blood ever sounded, before the bitter frost of the Alps could ever touch him, there was fire. Before the suffocating silent snowstorms of Europe, there was the blinding, relentless sun of the ancient Near East. If you are still lying there, safe beneath your blankets, I want you to shift your imagination away from that freezing mountain pass. Let the cold melt away. Let the air in your room become warm, heavy and fragrant with the scent of dry earth.
We are traveling
back further in time
to the sun-baked plains where Surus first opened his eyes.
Surus was not your typical African forest elephant, the smaller, more docile breed frequently utilized by the armies of Carthage.
No,
he belonged to a distinct, far more formidable lineage,
the Syrian elephant,
a magnificent subspecies
that has long since vanished from the face of the earth,
slipping quietly into the shadows of extinction.
In the ancient world,
these giants were the undisputed kings of the land,
the largest
elephants to walk the earth west of India.
Try to picture him in his absolute prime,
a colossal beast
standing nearly 10 feet tall at the shoulder,
casting a massive cooling shadow over the cracked, dry soil.
His
deeply wrinkled hide was perpetually caked in dried red mud.
In the wild,
this mud was his sanctuary.
It was a natural armor he painstakingly sprayed over his own back,
using his trunk,
shielding his sensitive skin from the stinging bites of savanna insects
and the scorching midday heat.
Listen to the rhythm of his life back then.
It was a life dictated
not by the ambitions of kings,
but by the slow, eternal turning of the seasons.
You could hear the rough, dry texture of palm
scraping
fronds
against his massive flanks
as he pushed his way through the brush.
You could feel the deep, low-frequency rumbling vibrating in his chest.
A secret
subsonic language he used to communicate with his herd across vast, shimmering distances.
His world was composed of simple, perfect truths.
The earthy smell of the dirt right before a heavy downpour.
The sweet taste of wild roots.
And the cool relief of standing knee-deep in a slow-moving river as the sun set, turning the water into liquid gold.
Animals do not
study maps.
They do not comprehend the invisible borders that men draw in the sand.
They do not know what the Roman Republic is.
Nor do they care
about the vast, wealthy territories of Carthage.
For Surus,
the concept of an enemy was profoundly simple
and entirely natural.
An enemy was a prowling lion
hiding in the tall yellow grass.
An enemy was a sudden, devastating drought that dried up the seasonal waterholes.
There was no malice in his world.
No political intrigue.
No grand strategies for conquest.
There was only the fundamental quiet rhythm of survival.
Eat,
drink, walk,
protect the elders,
guide the young.
But nature is not
without its own battles.
Surus bore the
marks of a survivor.
If you looked closely at his massive
you would notice a striking imperfection.
One side of his jaw
boasted a massive sweeping curve of pristine white ivory.
Capable of uprooting small trees.
But the other side was violently splintered.
It was broken off halfway.
The jagged edge smoothed down by years of rubbing against tree bark.
It was a battle scar.
From some forgotten clash for dominance long ago.
A violent duel
with another giant over mating rights or territory.
That broken tusk
gave him an asymmetrical, fiercely battle-hardened appearance.
It made him look less
like a gentle giant.
And more like a scarred
veteran of the wild.
That is exactly why they noticed him.
Perhaps that jagged, broken piece of ivory was the very thing that sealed his tragic fate.
Humans have a strange obsession with turning the wild strength of nature into a symbol of their own power.
We tend to think of history
as something shaped by grand speeches in marble halls,
by the signing of treaties,
or by the shifting of borders on a piece of parchment.
But for Surus, history changed simply because of a shift in the wind.
A strange, sharp odor
drifting through the trees.
The bitter, metallic scent of bronze and iron.
If you listen closely,
you can almost hear the subtle shift in the atmosphere.
The birds suddenly stopped singing.
The crickets fell silent.
Subsonic rumbles of his herd turned into sharp, frantic trumpets of distress.
That eternal,
primitive piece of the wild.
The only life he had ever known.
Ended forever.
On the day men wearing gleaming armor stepped into his forest,
carrying heavy iron chains.
The transition from the wild
savannah
to the world of men
did not happen in a single violent moment.
It was a
agonizing erosion
of everything
Surus had ever known.
If you are lying in the dark
listening to the quiet rhythm of your own breathing,
I want you to imagine a
sudden
shift in the atmosphere.
The gentle rustling of palm leaves
is gone.
The soft, muddy banks of the watering hole
in their place In their place is a dense, suffocating cloud of dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of an enormous military encampment.
We have arrived in Iberia.
We have arrived in
at
Iberia,
at the staging grounds of New Carthage.
And the air here is heavy, not with rain, but with the suffocating weight of human ambition.
Try to visualize the sheer scale of the chaos surrounding Surus.
The camp is a sprawling, wretched ocean of canvas tents and crude wooden palisades,
stretching out as far as the eye can see.
Tens of thousands of mercenaries from across the known world are gathered here.
Numidian cavalrymen,
Numidian
Iberian infantry,
Balearic
slingers.
Balearic
The
slingers.
noise is a constant, deafening roar.
It is a chaotic symphony of shouting voices in a dozen different languages.
The relentless clattering of bronze shields being stacked, and the rhythmic bone-rattling thud of blacksmiths' hammers striking anvils day and night.
For an animal whose ears are sensitive enough to hear the rumble of a rainstorm from miles away, this camp is a living nightmare.
The sensory overload is absolute.
Every instinct in Surus's massive body screams at him to turn around,
through the wooden gates,
to smash through the wooden gates, and to run back into the silent embrace of the wild.
But he cannot.
Coarse hemp
ropes,
coarse hemp ropes, thicker than a man's arm, bind his massive legs to deep-driven wooden pylons. Heavy iron cuffs, cold and unforgiving, chafe against the sensitive skin of his ankles.
He is not alone in his captivity.
Confined in tightly packed wooden enclosures, are 36 other elephants.
Some are smaller African forest elephants,
nervously shifting their weight from side to side.
Their trunks curling and uncurling.
They are communicating with each other.
Not with sounds that human ears can detect. But through those deep, subsonic rumbles, vibrating through the compacted earth. It is a continuous, invisible wave of fear and confusion, passing beneath the feet of the oblivious soldiers. They are mourning the loss of their freedom. They are terrified of the fire that burns in the great furnaces, just a few hundred yards away. But the most terrifying part of this new world is not the noise,
it is
nor
what
the
the
fire.
humans are doing to their
It is what
bodies.
the humans are doing to their bodies.
Listen closely to the sound of
heavy metal dragging across the dirt. A group of Carthaginian armorers approaches Surus. They carry pieces of a strange, unnatural second skin. First comes the thick leather padding. It smells foul. A mixture of animal fat,
and the pungent
sour
oils
sweat,
used to
and the
treat the
pungent
hides.
oils used to treat the hides. The handlers throw this heavy padding over Surus's broad back, the rough material scraping against his dry skin. He flinches, letting out a low, but a sharp, warning rumble, biting poke from the mahout's bronze-tipped anchors behind his ear, forces him to stand still.
Then comes the iron.
Then comes the iron.
They bolt
Piece
and
by
strap
piece,
crude metal
they
plating
bolt and
onto the
strap
leather.
crude metal plating.
You can hear
onto
the heavy
leather.
clinking of iron
You can hear the
rings,
heavy clinking of iron rings,
the thick leather belts,
the squeaking
as
of
they
the
are
thick
pulled
leather
violently
belts,
tight
as they are
around his
pulled
massive
violently
belly.
tight around
It
his
restricts
massive
his
belly.
breathing.
It restricts
the
his
heat of his
breathing.
massive body,
It traps the
making
heat of
him
his
sweat
massive body,
profusely in the
making him
crowded,
sweat
stagnant
profusely in
air
the
of the
crowded,
camp.
stagnant
They are
air of the
transforming him
camp.
from a living,
They are transforming him from a living,
into a
breathing
walking
creature,
fortress,
into
a
a
weapon of
walking
mass
fortress,
destruction,
a weapon of
crafted
mass
flesh and
destruction,
steel.
crafted of
The
flesh
final
and steel.
insult is the howdah,
The final insult
the wooden tower.
is the howdah.
It takes
the
6
wooden
men
tower.
pulling on thick
It takes
ropes
6
to hoist
men
the
pulling
heavy,
on thick
splintering
ropes to
wooden
hoist the
structure
heavy,
onto
splintering
Surus's
wooden
spine.
structure onto
Once it is
Surus's
secured,
spine.
strapped
Once
down
it is
with
secured,
absolute ruthlessness,
strapped down with
Surus
absolute
feels a
ruthlessness,
crushing,
Surus feels a
weight
crushing,
pressing down on
unnatural
his
weight,
vertebrae.
pressing
This
down
tower
on his
is
vertebrae.
designed to hold
This
3
tower
armed
is
men,
designed to hold
archers
3
and
armed
spearmen,
men,
who will rain
archers
death
and spearmen,
down upon the
who
enemy.
will rain death
But to
down upon the
Surus,
enemy.
It is just a
But to
heavy,
Surus,
suffocating
it is just a
burden
heavy,
that throws off his
suffocating
natural
burden
balance,
that throws off his
making
natural
every step
balance,
feel labored
making
and
every
clumsy.
step feel labored
Why must
and
they
clumsy.
wear this heavy iron?
Why must they wear
Why
this
must they
heavy
carry
iron?
these wooden towers?
Why must they carry
In the
these wooden
wild,
towers?
an elephant needs
In the
no
wild,
armor.
an
Their
elephant
size
needs
is
no
their
armor.
ultimate defense.
Their size is
But
their
Hannibal
ultimate
knows
defense.
something the elephants
But
do
Hannibal
not.
knows something
He
the
knows that
elephants
the
do
men they
not.
are marching to
He
face
knows that the
do
men
not
they are
fight with
marching to
claws or
face
teeth.
do not fight
They
with
fight
claws
with
or
flying
teeth.
spears.
They fight
They
with
fight
flying
with
spears.
organized lines of
They fight
stabbing
with
swords.
organized lines
The
of
armor is
stabbing
not a gift.
swords.
It is
The
a
armor
cruel
is not a
necessity
gift.
to
It is a
ensure these
cruel
animals
necessity
survive
to
long
ensure
enough
these
to
animals
break the
survive
enemy
long
lines
enough to
before
break
they are
the enemy
inevitably
lines
slaughtered.
before they are
The training
inevitably
is a
slaughtered.
psychological torture
The training is a
designed to
psychological
break their
torture
most primal
designed to
instincts.
break their most
For weeks,
primal
the
instincts.
mahouts forced
For
Surus
weeks,
and the
the
others
mahouts
to
forced
stand their
Surus
ground,
and the others
while
to
soldiers
stand their
scream
ground
and bang
while
their
soldiers
shields
scream
directly in
and
front
bang
of
their
their
shields
faces
directly in front of their faces,
near their feet.
They throw burning torches near their feet, beating the elephants if they try to instinctively back away from the flames.
Yet deeply perverse.
The goal is simple,
to sever the animal's natural instinct for self-preservation,
to make them fear the sharp hook of their master,
the noise,
more than they
and the
fear
smell
the
of
fire,
blood.
the noise, and the smell of blood.
Being older,
larger,
and
being
perhaps
older,
wiser than the
larger,
younger elephants,
and perhaps wiser than the younger elephants. Watches this all with a stoic,
his one good
mournful
tusk has been
endurance.
polished and
His
capped
one
with a
good
sharp
tusk has been
bronze
polished
point.
and capped
A
with a
deadly
sharp bronze
enhancement
point
to his natural
A
weaponry.
deadly enhancement
His
to his
broken
natural
tusk
weaponry.
remains blunt.
His broken
A silent
tusk remains
testament to a
blunt.
past life
A silent
that feels
testament to a
increasingly
past
like a
life
distant dream.
that feels increasingly
As the
like a
days
distant
turn
dream.
into weeks,
As the
chaos
days
of the
turn into
camp
weeks,
begins to shift.
the chaos of the
The
camp
endless
begins to
forging of
shift.
weapons slows
The
down.
endless forging
The
of
mountain
weapons
of grain
slows
and
down.
dried meat is
The mountain
loaded
of
onto
grain and
thousands of
dried
pack
meat is
mules.
loaded onto
The air
thousands of
grows
pack
thick
mules.
with a tense,
The air
terrifying
grows thick with a
anticipation.
tense,
The
terrifying
time for
anticipation.
preparation is over.
The time
The
for
largest
preparation
army
is
the
over.
ancient world has
The
seen in a
largest army the
generation
ancient world
is ready
has
to
seen in a
move.
generation is
And as
ready to
Hannibal
move.
Barca steps out of his
And
command
as Hannibal
tent,
Barca
looking
steps
over
out
the
of his
vast
command
sea of
tent,
helmets and
looking over the
spears,
vast
his
sea of
eyes
helmets
settle on
and
the
spears,
massive,
his
armored
eyes settle
forms
on
of
the
his
massive,
37 elephants.
armored forms of
He
his
gives the
37
signal.
elephants.
The deep,
He gives the
mournful
signal.
blast of the
The
war
deep,
horns
mournful
tears
blast
through
of
the
the war
sky.
horns
The march
tears
has
through the
begun.
sky.
And for
The
Surus,
march has begun.
every heavy,
And for
armor-clad
Surus,
step
every
he takes
heavy,
forward
armor-clad
is a
step
further
he
away
takes
from the
forward
sun,
is a
and
step further
closer
away from the sun,
to a freezing,
and a step
white
closer
hell
to a
he cannot
freezing,
possibly
white
comprehend.
hell he cannot
The
possibly
blast of the
comprehend.
Carthaginian war horns
The blast of
did
the
not fade
Carthaginian
quickly.
war horns
It
did
hung
not
in the
fade
dusty
quickly.
air, a long,
It hung in the dusty
mournful
air,
vibration
a long,
that seemed to seep
mournful
into the very
vibration
marrow of the
that
earth.
seemed to seep
And
into the
then
very
the
marrow
ground
of the earth.
began to tremble.
And then the
It was not
ground
the
began
sudden
to tremble.
chaotic tremor of
It
an
was not the
earthquake,
sudden
but the
chaotic
slow,
tremor of an earthquake,
rhythmic,
but the
terrifying
slow,
pulse
rhythmic,
of a massive
terrifying
military
pulse
machine
of a
lurching
massive
into
military
motion.
machine.
If you are
lurching
listening
into
to
motion.
this in the quiet of your room,
If you are listening to
try
this
to
in the
imagine
quiet
the
of your
sheer
room,
physical weight
try
of
to
that
imagine
movement.
the sheer physical
90,000
weight of
men,
that movement.
12,000
90,000
horses,
men,
and 37
12,000
armored
horses,
giants.
and
The dust
37
kicked up
armored
by their
giants.
marching feet
The
was
dust
so
kicked up
thick,
by their
it
marching
blotted
feet
out the lower
was
half
so
of the
thick,
sun,
it blotted
casting
out the
an
lower
eerie,
half of the sun,
rust-colored twilight
casting an
over the
eerie,
landscape,
rust-colored
even at
twilight
midday.
over the landscape,
For Surus,
even at midday.
walking near the vanguard,
For Surus,
this dust
walking
was
near
a
the
constant,
vanguard,
choking
this
presence.
dust was a
It
constant,
coated the
choking
inside of his
presence.
sensitive trunk.
It coated the
It settled
inside of
into
his
the deep
sensitive
wrinkles
trunk.
of his grey
It
skin,
settled into the deep
turning him
wrinkles
into
of
a
his grey
spectral,
skin,
moving
turning him into
statue
a
of dirt and
spectral,
iron.
moving statue
Their
of
first
dirt
great
and
obstacle
iron.
was not
Their
an enemy
first great
army,
obstacle
but the sea
was not
itself.
an enemy army,
To reach the
but the
lands of
sea
Europe,
itself.
Hannibal had
To
to
reach
move
the
this
lands of
colossal
Europe,
force
Hannibal
across
had to
the
move this
turbulent
colossal
waters
force
near the pillars
across
of
the
Hercules,
turbulent waters
what we now
near the
call
pillars of
the
Hercules,
Strait of Gibraltar.
what we now call
History
the
books
Strait of
often
Gibraltar.
describe this crossing
History books
as a brilliant
often describe
logistical
this
triumph.
crossing as a
They
brilliant
praise the
logistical
ingenuity
triumph.
of the Carthaginian
They praise the
engineers
ingenuity
who
of the
lashed together
Carthaginian
massive wooden
engineers
transport
who lashed
barges,
together massive
covering
wooden
them with
transport
dirt and
barges,
branches,
covering
to
them
deceive
with
the
dirt
animals
and
into
branches,
thinking they were still
to deceive
walking
the
on
animals
solid
into
ground.
thinking they were still
But if you
walking
strip
on
away
solid
the
ground.
awe of human achievement,
But if you strip away
what
the awe
remains
of human
is
achievement,
the silent terror
what
of the
remains
captive.
is the silent terror
Imagine
of
the
the
heavy,
captive.
nauseating smell
Imagine
of
the
salt
heavy,
water,
nauseating
rotting
smell
seaweed,
of salt
and
water,
wet timber.
rotting seaweed, and wet timber.
Blindfolded by thick
Surus,
canvas, to keep him from
blindfolded by
panicking,
thick canvas,
was coaxed
to
onto
keep
a
him from
massive,
panicking,
creaking
was
raft.
coaxed onto a massive,
The moment his heavy
creaking
feet
raft.
left the firm,
The moment his
predictable
heavy
earth
feet left
and
the
stepped
firm,
onto the shifting,
predictable earth,
hollow wooden
and stepped
planks,
onto the shifting,
a deep rumble
hollow
of
wooden
distress
planks,
vibrated in his
a deep
chest.
rumble of distress
Water is a
vibrated in his
chaotic
chest.
element.
Water
Beneath his feet
is a chaotic
the raft
element.
pitched and rolled
Beneath his
with
feet,
the unforgiving
the
swell
raft
of the
pitched and
Mediterranean.
rolled with the unforgiving
The iron
swell
armor
of the
strapped to his
Mediterranean.
belly
The
clinked
iron
heavily
armor
against the
strapped to
wooden
his belly
railings,
clinked
as he
heavily
constantly
against the
shifted
wooden
his
railings
immense weight,
as he constantly
desperately trying
shifted
to
his
find a
immense
center of
weight,
balance
desperately
that no
trying to
longer
find a
existed.
center of balance
All around him
that
in
no
the
longer
humid
existed.
darkness, he
All
could hear
around
the
him in the
frantic
humid
subsonic
darkness,
rumbles of
he
his
could
kin.
hear the frantic
36
subsonic
other
rumbles of
elephants
his kin.
trapped in a floating
36
nightmare,
other elephants
completely
trapped
at the
in a
mercy
floating
of the
nightmare,
crashing waves,
completely
and
at the
shouting
mercy of the
humans
crashing
pulling at the
waves,
oars.
and the
For a
shouting
creature
humans
whose
pulling at
entire
the oars, existence relies on feeling the solid vibrations of the earth.
Was the moment
This journey
the world
across the
itself
sea
seemed to betray
was
them.
the moment the world
When his
itself
feet
seemed to
finally
betray
touched
them.
dry land again.
When his feet finally touched dry land again. The canvas blindfold was ripped away, but the world revealed to his tired eyes was not the one he had left behind.
Peninsula.
They had landed on the
was still
Iberian
hot,
Peninsula,
but the air felt
the
different.
sun was still hot.
It was sharper,
but the air felt
carrying
different.
the scent of
It was
strange,
sharper,
bitter vegetation,
carrying the scent
and
of
alien
strange,
soils.
bitter vegetation
This
and
was the
alien
true
soils.
beginning of the Great
This
March.
was the true beginning
slow, of the great
agonizing
march,
process of
a
physical
slow
and
agonizing
spiritual
process of physical
With every passing
and
day,
spiritual attrition.
the landscape shifted
With every
further
passing
away
day,
from anything
the landscape
Surus
shifted
recognized.
further away
The
from
familiar
anything
sweet
Surus
roots and soft
recognized.
grasses of
The
his
familiar
homeland
sweet roots
were
and
replaced
soft
by the
grasses
tough,
of his homeland
scrubby vegetation
were replaced
of the
by the tough,
Mediterranean coast.
scrubby vegetation of the Mediterranean coast.
Surus found
When the
no
army
deep,
stopped to
clear
drink,
watering holes.
Surus found no
Instead,
deep, clear
he was
watering
forced to
holes.
thrust his trunk
Instead,
into shallow,
he was
muddy
forced to
rivers
thrust his
that had
trunk
already
into
been
shallow,
churned into
muddy
a brown
rivers
paste
that had
by
already
the
been
thousands
churned
of
into a
horses
brown
that had crossed
paste
just
by the
hours before
thousands
him.
of horses that
The
had crossed
concept
just
of
hours
exhaustion
before
for a
him.
creature of this size
The concept
is
of
profound.
exhaustion for a
It is not
creature
the
of this
sudden,
size is
sharp
profound.
pain of a spear
It is
wound.
not the sudden,
It is a
sharp
dull,
pain of a spear
relentless
wound.
ache
It is
that
a
begins
dull,
in the thick
relentless
pads of the feet
ache that
and
begins
slowly
in the
creeps
thick
up
pads of
into
the
the
feet
massive joints
and
of the
slowly
legs.
creeps up
The
into
heavy
the
wooden
massive
howdah
joints of the
strapped to
legs.
his spine
The heavy
was
wooden
no longer
howdah
just a
strapped to
burden.
his spine
It became
was
an
no longer
instrument
just
of
a
slow
burden.
torture.
It
With
became
every
an
single
instrument
step,
of slow
the
torture.
crude wooden frame
With every
swayed
single step,
slightly.
the
The
crude
thick
wooden
leather
frame
belts
swayed
grinding
slightly.
mercilessly into
The
his
thick
hide.
leather belts
Yet,
grinding
the
mercilessly
march
into
never
his
stopped.
hide.
The
Yet,
mahout sitting
the
on
march
Surus's
never
neck,
stopped.
a
The
man who
mahout
perhaps
sitting on
loved the
Surus's
beast,
neck,
but feared
a
his
man who
commander
perhaps
more,
loved the beast,
would gently
but feared his
firmly
commander
tap
more,
the bronze
would
hook
gently
against the
but
elephant's
firmly
skull.
tap the
It was a
bronze hook
rhythmic,
against the
cruel
elephant's skull.
reminder.
It was a
Keep
rhythmic,
moving.
cruel
Always
reminder.
forward.
Keep moving.
If you are lying there,
always forward.
drifting towards sleep,
If you are lying
let
there,
your breathing
drifting
synchronize
towards
with
sleep,
the heavy,
let your
plodding
breathing
rhythm of those
synchronize with the
footsteps.
heavy,
One
plodding
massive
rhythm of those
footfall after
footsteps.
another.
One
Thud.
massive footfall
The clinking
after
of
another.
iron rings.
Thud,
Thud.
the clinking
The
of
creaking
iron
of dry
rings.
leather.
Thud,
Thud.
the creaking
It was
of
a
dry
hypnotic,
leather.
exhausting
Thud.
trance.
It was
that
a
stretched
hypnotic,
across hundreds
exhausting
of miles,
trance
through
that stretched
dusty
across
Iberian
hundreds of
plains,
miles,
across
through dusty
fast-flowing
Iberian
rivers,
plains,
and deep into
across
the dense,
fast-flowing
dark
rivers,
forests of Gaul.
and deep into the dense,
Surus did
dark
not know
forests
it,
of Gaul.
but with every step he
Surus
took,
did not know
the
it,
air was growing
but with every
slightly
step he
cooler.
took,
The shadows
the air was
cast by the
growing
trees
slightly
were growing
cooler.
slightly longer.
The shadows
The
cast by the
warm,
trees were
sun-drenched
growing
world
slightly
he once
longer.
knew
The
was
warm,
slowly
sun-drenched
slipping away
world he
behind the
once
horizon,
knew was
replaced
slowly
by the
slipping
looming,
away behind
jagged
the horizon,
silhouette of a mountain
replaced
range
by the
that
looming,
seemed to
jagged
tear the very
silhouette of a
sky
mountain
apart.
range
The
that seemed to
Alps were
tear the
waiting,
very sky
and they
apart.
were holding their breath.
The Alps were waiting.
Let's pause
and they
for
were
a
holding
moment.
their breath.
If you are lying there,
let's pause for a
listening to
moment.
the sound of my voice
If you are
in the
lying
dark,
there,
I want
listening
you
to the
pull
sound
your
of my
blanket
voice in the
just
dark,
a little bit
I
tighter.
want you to pull your
The
blanket
warm,
just a
dusty
little bit
plains
tighter.
of Iberia
The warm,
are now far
dusty
behind us.
plains of Iberia
The air in our
are now
story
far behind
is about
us.
to change
The air in
drastically,
our story
and I want you
is
to
about
feel
to
that
change
chill
drastically,
creeping into
and
the
I want you to
atmosphere.
feel that chill
It is the
creeping
late
into
autumn
the
of the year
atmosphere.
218 BC.
It is the late autumn of the year
Carthaginian war machine,
218 BC.
exhausted but
the
unbroken,
Carthaginian war
has
machine,
finally reached
exhausted
the
but
foothills of the
unbroken,
Alps.
has
The
finally
geography
reached the
itself is
foothills of the
mutating
Alps.
into something alien
The
and
geography
hostile.
itself is
The
mutating
soft,
into something
forgiving
alien
dirt
and
has
hostile.
disappeared,
The soft,
replaced by
forgiving
jagged,
dirt has
uneven
disappeared,
rocks, and a
replaced
thick,
by
damp
jagged,
carpet
uneven
of rotting
rocks,
pine needles.
and a thick,
The
damp
familiar
carpet of
broadleaf
rotting
trees
pine
have given
needles.
way to towering,
The familiar
shadowy
broadleaf
conifers.
trees have given way
Ancient
to
pines
towering,
and massive
shadowy
spruces
conifers.
line the winding
Ancient
upward
pines
path,
and massive
looking like
spruces
black,
line the winding
silent
upward
sentinels
path,
guarding the
looking
gates
like
of a
black,
frozen hell.
silent sentinels
Listen to
guarding
the wind.
gates of a frozen
It has lost
hell.
the gentle, sweeping
Listen
rhythm
to the
of
wind.
the Mediterranean
It has
coast.
lost the gentle,
Up
sweeping
here,
rhythm of
as
the
it funnels through
Mediterranean
the narrow,
coast.
twisting
Up
ravines
here,
of the lower
as it
mountains,
funnels through the
it
narrow,
begins to
twisting
shriek.
ravines of the
It
lower
howls over
mountains.
the sharp
It
rock
begins
faces,
to shriek,
creating a
it howls
high-pitched,
over the sharp
wailing
rock faces,
symphony
creating a
that sounds
high-pitched,
remarkably like a chorus
wailing
of
symphony
mournful war
that
horns.
sounds remarkably
It is a
like a
warning
chorus
from
of
the mountain
mournful
itself.
war horns.
A warning
It is a
that
warning
Hannibal
from the
Barca
mountain
chooses
itself.
to ignore.
A warning
For
that Hannibal
Surus,
Barca
the
chooses
giant
to ignore.
Syrian bull,
For
this changing
Surus,
landscape
the giant
brings
Syrian
a
bull,
physical
this
sensation
changing landscape
he has never encountered
brings a
in his
physical
long,
sensation
sun-drenched life.
he has never encountered
The
in his
cold.
long, sun-drenched
This is not
life.
the fleeting, crisp
the cold.
chill of a desert night.
This is
that
not the
fades as
fleeting,
soon as
crisp
the morning
chill
sun
of a desert
rises.
night that
This
fades
is
as
a
soon as
deep,
the morning
predatory
sun
cold.
rises.
It is a
This
heavy,
is a deep,
damp
predatory
frost
cold
that bites
It
at
is
the
a
edges
heavy,
of his sensitive
damp
ears
frost
and
that
seeps
bites at the edges
relentlessly
of
into
his sensitive
colossal
ears
bones.
and seeps relentlessly into his colossal bones.
Of his biological design.
Consider the tragic irony of his biological design. Everything about Surus was perfected by nature over millions of years. To survive in the blistering heat of the Near East, his enormous ears were built to act as massive cooling radiators, flapping to expel body heat into the hot air. His thick, deeply wrinkled skin was designed to trap mud and moisture, creating a natural shade against the relentless sun. But here, in the freezing shadow of the Alps, those evolutionary miracles become a fatal trap. His body is hemorrhaging heat.
Like the shivering
He cannot
Numidian
put on a
mercenaries
thick wool
marching
cloak
beside him.
like the shivering Numidian mercenaries marching beside him.
He cannot huddle around a blazing campfire.
Every time Surus
he is
exhales,
entirely exposed.
A thick, violent
Every time Surus
exhales,
erupts from
a
the
thick,
end of his
violent
long trunk.
plume of white
It
steam
hangs in the
erupts
freezing
from the
air
end
for
of
a
his long
heartbeat.
trunk.
A ghostly
It hangs
cloud
in the
of his
freezing
vanishing
air
life
for a
force.
heartbeat.
Before
A
the
ghostly
bitter wind
cloud of his
tears it
vanishing
away.
life force.
And
Before
then
the bitter
there is
wind
the
tears
armor.
it away.
The thick iron
And then
plates and heavy
there is the
bronze
armor.
chains strapped
The
across
thick
his
iron
massive
plates
belly
and heavy bronze
were meant to
chains
protect him
strapped
from
across
Roman
his
spears.
massive belly
But
were
iron
meant to protect
is an
him from Roman
unforgiving metal.
spears. But
In this
iron
sub-zero
is an
environment,
unforgiving metal.
The armor acts as a
In this
lethal
sub-zero
conductor.
environment,
The metal
the
plates
armor
draw the
acts
heat
as a lethal
directly out of his
conductor.
core.
The metal
Turning
plates
into
draw the
slabs of
heat
freezing
directly
ice,
out of his core,
pressed tightly
turning
against
into
his vital
slabs of
organs.
freezing ice,
The thick
pressed
leather
tightly
belts
against
holding
his
the
vital
wooden tower
organs.
on his back.
The thick leather
Stiffened by
belts
the
holding
frost,
the wooden tower
begin to
on his
crack
back
and bite brutally
stiffened by
into
the
his
frost,
grey hide.
begin to
With
crack
every
and
laboured
bite
step.
brutally into his
He
grey
is
hide.
not the only one
with every
suffering.
laboured step.
All around him,
He
the
is not the
remaining
only one
36
suffering.
elephants are falling
All
into a
around
state
him,
of
the
primal,
remaining
quiet
36
panic.
elephants are falling
If you
into a
could place
state
your
of
ear to the
primal,
ground
quiet
and
panic.
hear below the
If you could
threshold
place
of
your
human
ear to the
hearing,
ground,
you would feel
and
the
hear
earth
below the
vibrating
threshold
with
of
their
human
distress.
hearing,
The
you would
low,
feel the earth
subsonic
vibrating
rumbles
with
they
their
use to
distress.
communicate have
The low,
changed pitch.
subsonic rumbles
The
they
slow,
use to
comforting
communicate
hum of the
have
herd
changed
has
pitch.
turned into rapid,
The slow,
agitated
comforting hum
bursts
of the herd
acoustic
has
anxiety.
turned into rapid,
They are blind in the
agitated
thickening
bursts of
fog.
acoustic anxiety.
They are freezing.
They are
And
blind
their
in the
deep
thickening
collective
fog.
consciousness
They are
is
freezing,
screaming a single,
and their deep
terrifying
collective
truth.
consciousness
This
is
place
screaming
is
a
wrong.
single,
We are
terrifying
not supposed
truth.
to be here.
This place is
mahouts,
wrong.
The men
We are
who
not
have
supposed
raised
to be
and trained
here.
these beasts
The mahouts,
since they were calves.
the men who have
try
raised and
desperately
trained
to
these
calm them.
beasts since
You
they
can
were
hear
calves,
the desperate, hushed
try
voices
desperately
of the
to calm
handlers,
them. You can
speaking
hear
in
the
soothing
desperate,
Punic
hushed voices
tones,
of the handlers,
rubbing their freezing
speaking in
bare
soothing
hands
Punic
against the
tones,
elephant's coarse
rubbing
trunks.
their freezing
But what
bare
comfort
hands
can a
against
frail
the elephant's
human
coarse
offer a freezing
trunks.
giant?
But what comfort
They have no
can a
extra
frail
food to
human
give.
offer a
They have no
freezing
shelter
giant?
to provide.
They have no extra
They only
food
have
to
the
give.
sharp
They
bronze
have no
hook
shelter to
ensure the
provide.
beasts keep
They
moving
only have
forward,
the sharp
up
bronze
the
hook to
relentless
ensure the
incline.
beasts keep moving
Why
forward
force them into this
up the
frozen
relentless
abyss?
incline.
Military
Why
historians will
force them
tell
into
you
this frozen
it was
abyss?
a stroke of absolute
Military
genius.
historians will tell you
Hannibal knew
it was a
that the
stroke
Roman
of
Republic
absolute
felt
genius.
perfectly secure
Hannibal
behind
knew that the Roman
impenetrable
Republic
wall of
felt
the Alps.
perfectly secure
No one in their
behind the
right mind
impenetrable
believed a
wall of the
massive
Alps.
army,
No
let
one in
alone
their
an
right
army dragging
mind believed a
37
massive
war
army,
elephants
let
could
alone an
scale
army
those
dragging
jagged peaks in the
37
dead of
war
autumn.
elephants.
The
could
element of
scale those
surprise would
jagged
be
peaks
absolute.
in the dead of autumn.
But genius
The
often
element of
demands a
surprise would be
terrible
absolute.
sacrifice.
But
The true
genius
price of
often
this
demands a
tactical
terrible
brilliance
sacrifice.
is being paid right
The
now.
true price of this
In the
tactical
silent,
brilliance
shivering
is being
agony
paid right
of
now.
these magnificent
in the
animals.
silent, shivering
The march
agony
slows to
of
a
these
grueling
magnificent
crawl.
animals.
The path narrows,
The march slows
winding
to a
sharply
grueling
upward
crawl.
into a
the
thick,
path
blinding
narrows,
soup of
winding
grey mist
sharply upward
and falling
into
snow.
a thick, blinding
The true
soup
ascent
of
has
grey
begun.
mist.
The
and
mountain
falling
is
snow.
waiting to claim
The
its
true
toll.
ascent has begun.
And Surus,
the mountain
his
is waiting
broken
to
tusk
claim
leading
its
the way
toll.
through the biting
and
frost,
Surus
takes
his
his
broken
first heavy
tusk
step
leading the
into
way
the
through the
white
biting
nightmare.
frost,
And
takes
that
his
white
first heavy
nightmare
step
was not
into the white
empty.
nightmare.
The higher they
And
climbed,
that white
the
nightmare
narrower
was
the
not
path
empty.
became.
The higher they
Eventually
climbed,
shrinking
the
to a
narrower the
precarious
path
ledge,
became,
barely wide
eventually
enough for a
shrinking
single
to a
horse,
precarious
let
ledge,
alone a
barely
colossal
wide enough for
Syrian
a single
elephant.
horse,
To their
let
left
alone
was a
colossal
sheer,
Syrian
jagged
elephant.
wall of freezing
To their
stone.
left
To
was a
their right,
sheer,
a drop
jagged
into
wall
absolute
of freezing
nothingness.
stone.
An abyss
to their
obscured
right,
by the
a drop into
swirling heavy
absolute
mist.
nothingness.
If you are
An
lying
abyss
in the
obscured
quiet
by
of
the
your
swirling
room,
heavy mist.
perfectly safe.
If you
I
are
want
lying
you
in
to
the quiet
imagine
of
the
your
sheer
room,
vulnerability
perfectly safe,
of being trapped
I
on
want
that
you to
ledge.
imagine the sheer
You are
vulnerability
massive.
of
You are
being
covered
trapped
in
on
iron.
that ledge.
Every step
You
you
are
take
massive.
threatens
You
to
are
shatter
covered
the
in
fragile
iron.
crust of
Every
ice
step you
beneath your
take
feet.
threatens
And
to
somewhere up
shatter the
above,
fragile
hidden
crust of ice
entirely
beneath
within
your
the thick
feet.
grey fog,
And somewhere up above,
eyes are watching
hidden
you.
entirely
The
within the
native
thick
Celtic
grey
tribes
fog,
of the Alps,
eyes are
the
watching you.
Allobroges,
The
did not
native
fight
Celtic
like the
tribes of the
Romans.
Alps,
They did
the
not form
Allobroges,
neat, predictable
did not
lines
fight
on a
like the
flat
Romans.
battlefield.
They did not
They were the
form
ghosts
neat,
of the
predictable
mountain.
lines on
They
a flat
understood the devastating power
They
of
were the
gravity.
ghosts of the mountain.
The ambush did not
They understood
begin
the
with a war
devastating
cry.
power of gravity.
It began with a sound
The ambush
that
did not
strikes
begin
primal
with a
terror
war cry.
into any creature
It began
that
with a
walks the
sound
earth.
that strikes
A
primal
low
terror
grinding
into
vibration.
any creature that walks
A single
the earth.
pebble bouncing
A
down
low
the cliff
grinding
face.
vibration.
Then
a single
fist-sized
pebble
rock.
bouncing down the
And
cliff
then
face.
the mountain
Then
itself
a
seemed to
fist-sized
tear
rock.
apart.
And
Listen
then
to the terrifying
the mountain
physics of a
itself seemed to
rockfall.
tear apart.
It is not just a
Listen to the
sound.
terrifying
It is a
physics of a
violent
rockfall.
disruption of the air.
It is not just
Massive
a sound.
boulders.
It is a violent
dislodged by the
disruption of the
tribesmen
air.
above.
Massive
Came hurtling
boulders,
down through the
dislodged
fog.
by the
They
tribesmen
smashed
above,
against the cliff walls,
came hurtling down
shattering
through the
into
fog.
deadly,
They smashed
razor-sharp
against the cliff
shrapnel.
walls,
The heavy,
shattering into
sickening
deadly,
thud of
razor-sharp
stone-crushing
shrapnel.
bone echoed
The
through
heavy,
the narrow pass,
sickening thud of
followed
stone-crushing
instantly by the
bone
frantic,
echoed through the
echoing
narrow
screams
pass,
of horses,
followed
and
instantly
men
by the
being
frantic,
swept off the edge
echoing
into the
screams
void.
of horses
For an
and men
elephant,
being
there
swept
are
off
few
the edge
things
into
more
the void.
terrifying than unstable
For an
ground.
elephant, there are
They
few
are
things
creatures
more
that rely
terrifying than
entirely on the
unstable
solid,
ground. predictable
They are
foundation
creatures
of
that
the
rely
earth
entirely
to
on the
support their
solid,
immense weight.
predictable
They do not
foundation of
fear
the
men
earth
holding
to support
spears.
their immense
They
weight.
do not fear the
They do
shine
not
of
fear
swords,
men holding
but a
spears.
crumbling mountain.
They do not
That
fear the
triggers a
shine of
deep,
swords,
ancient panic
but a crumbling
locked
mountain.
within their DNA.
That triggers a deep,
All along
ancient
the narrow
panic
column,
locked
the
within
younger
their
elephants
DNA.
began to lose their minds.
All along the narrow
The
column,
sensory
the
overload
younger
was
elephants
absolute.
began to lose
The
their
whites
minds.
of their massive
The
eyes
sensory
bulged.
overload was
They
absolute.
trumpeted in high-pitched,
The whites of their
deafening
massive
shrieks
eyes
of
bulged.
pure terror.
They trumpeted
Wildly
in
thrashing their
high-pitched,
trunks in the
deafening
freezing
shrieks
air.
of pure terror,
Blinded by the
wildly
fog,
thrashing their
panicked by
trunks
the
in the
raining
freezing
stones,
air,
and tormented
blinded
by
by
the
the
shouting
fog,
of their handlers,
panicked by the
they
raining
began to
stones,
back up,
and
but
tormented
there was
by the
nowhere to
shouting
go.
of their handlers,
The
they
sound
began
of
to
an
back
armored
up,
war elephant
but there was
losing
nowhere
its
to
footing
go.
on ice is
The
something
sound of
history
an
books
armored
rarely
war
capture.
elephant losing its footing
It is
on
a
ice
slow,
is something
agonizing
history
sequence
books
of physical
rarely
failure.
capture.
The
It is a
desperate,
slow,
violent
agonizing
scraping
sequence of
thick
physical
toenails,
failure.
trying to dig
The
into
desperate,
solid rock.
violent
The
scraping of
sudden,
thick
unnatural
toenails,
shift in
trying
weight
to dig
as
into
the hind
solid
legs
rock.
give way.
The sudden,
The heavy
unnatural shift
metallic
in weight
crunch of the
as the
wooden
hind
howdah
legs give way,
smashing against the cliff
the heavy
face.
metallic crunch
And then
of the wooden
the
howdah
long, fading
smashing against the
scream
cliff face.
as a creature weighing
and then
thousands of
the
pounds
long, fading
tumbles
scream
over the edge,
as a creature
swallowed
weighing
completely
thousands
by
of
the white
pounds
mist below.
tumbles over the edge.
They called them
swallowed
war
completely
machines.
by the white
The
mist
generals,
below.
the historians,
They called them
the tacticians.
war machines.
They looked
the
at
generals,
these magnificent
the historians,
and saw
the tacticians.
only weapons of mass
They
destruction.
looked at these magnificent
but
beasts
in that horrific moment,
and saw only weapons
as the
of
sky
mass
rained
destruction.
jagged rocks and
But in that
poisoned
horrific
arrows,
moment,
they were not
as the sky
machines.
rained jagged
They were
rocks
just
and
pitiful,
poisoned arrows,
confused creatures,
they were not machines.
desperately trying to
they
find
were
a
just
place to
pitiful,
hide,
confused
in a world
creatures,
that offered no
desperately
shelter.
trying to find a
Yet,
place to
amidst
hide,
this
in a
chaotic
world that
symphony of
offered
death,
no shelter.
look at Surus.
Yet, amidst
The
this
giant
chaotic
Syrian
symphony
bull
of
did not
death,
panic.
look at
He
Surus.
did not thrash.
The giant
Whether it was
Syrian
the
bull
wisdom
did
of his
not
advanced
panic.
age,
He did
the
not
exhaustion
thrash.
in his bones,
Whether it was the
or
wisdom of
simply
his
a deep,
advanced age,
resigned
the
stoicism,
exhaustion in his bones,
Surus reacted
or simply
differently.
a deep,
As a
resigned
boulder the
stoicism,
size of a chariot
Surus
wheel
reacted
smashed
differently.
into the path just
as a
yards
boulder
ahead of
the
him,
size of a chariot
sending a
wheel
shower of
smashed
sharp,
into the
icy
path
shrapnel
just
into
yards
his
ahead
thick
of him,
hide.
sending a
simply
shower
stopped.
of sharp, icy
He
shrapnel
leaned
into
his
his
massive
thick hide.
armored side
He
heavily
simply
against
stopped.
the freezing stone wall
He
of the
leaned
cliff.
his massive
He
armored
lowered his
side
great
heavily
head,
against the
tucking his
freezing stone
sensitive
wall
trunk
of the cliff.
tightly against his
He
chest
lowered his great
to protect
head,
it.
tucking
And
his
he closed
sensitive
his
trunk
eyes.
tightly against his
He stood
chest
perfectly
to protect
still
it.
as the world
and
ended
he closed
around
his
him.
eyes.
The Celtic
He
warriors
stood
above
perfectly
screamed
still as
their
the
war
world
cries,
ended around him.
the sound
The
echoing
Celtic
bizarrely
warriors
in the cold
above
air.
screamed their
Roman
war cries,
arrows,
the
looted
sound
from
echoing
previous
bizarrely in the
skirmishes,
cold air.
rained down.
Roman arrows,
Some pinging
looted from
harmlessly
previous
off his iron
skirmishes,
plate.
rained
Others
down,
biting shallowly
some
into
pinging
his exposed
harmlessly off his
skin.
iron plates,
He felt the warm,
others
thick
biting
trickle of his
shallowly
own
into
blood,
his exposed
mixing
skin.
with the freezing snow
He
on
felt
his
the
back.
warm, thick
He
trickle
felt
of
the
his own
frantic,
blood,
trembling
mixing with the
hands of his
freezing
mahout,
snow on his back.
gripping the ropes
He
around
felt the
his neck,
frantic,
the
trembling
human crying
hands of
out
his
in
mahout,
prayers,
gripping the
God
ropes
Surus
around his
could not
neck.
comprehend.
The human crying out in
just stood
prayers
there,
to God
a silent,
Surus could not
bleeding mountain
comprehend.
within a mountain.
He just stood
He
there,
anchored himself
a
to the
silent,
rock,
bleeding
accepting
mountain
the
within a
pain,
mountain.
accepting
He
the
anchored
cold,
himself to the
waiting
rock,
with infinite
accepting the
patience for the
pain,
chaos of humans
accepting
to
the
pass.
cold, waiting
It is
with
a
infinite
profound,
patience for the chaos
heartbreaking
of
display
humans
of
to
endurance.
pass.
While
It is
the
a
men around him
profound,
fought,
heartbreaking
killed,
display of
and
endurance.
died for the abstract
While the men
concept
around
of an
him
empire,
fought, killed,
Surus simply
and died for
endured
the abstract
for the sake
concept
of
of
the
an
next
empire.
breath.
Surus
Let
simply
that deep,
endured
stoic
for the sake of the
calmness
next
wash over
breath.
In the face of
Let
a
that
collapsing
deep,
world,
stoic
sometimes
calmness
the
wash
only
over
thing
you.
you can do
In the
is
face of a
close your
collapsing
eyes,
world,
press your back
sometimes
against
the only
wall,
thing you can
and
do
wait for the
is
storm
close
to
your
run
eyes,
its course.
press your back
The
against the
ambush
wall,
from the Celtic
and wait for
tribesmen
the storm to run
eventually
its course.
ceased. But they did
The
not
ambush
retreat
from the Celtic
because the
tribesmen
Carthaginian
eventually
army had won a
ceased.
decisive victory.
But they did not retreat
They stopped
because the
mountain
Carthaginian
itself
army had won a
decided to
decisive
intervene.
victory.
If
They
you are
stopped
lying in
because
the
the
warmth of
mountain
your bed,
itself had
I
decided
want
to
you to
intervene.
appreciate the stillness
If you
of
are
the
lying
air
in the
around
warmth
you,
of your bed,
because up on
I
that
want you to
narrow,
appreciate
jagged
the
pass,
stillness of the
the
air around
atmosphere
you.
suddenly fractured.
Because up on that
the
narrow,
temperature
jagged
plummeted
pass,
so rapidly,
the atmosphere
so
suddenly
violently,
fractured.
that it
The
felt
temperature
like a physical
plummeted so rapidly, so violently,
which
that
had
it felt like a physical blow to the chest.
Of grey fog.
The sky,
darkened
which had
into
been a
bruised,
swirling, oppressive
terrifying
mass
shade
of grey
purple.
fog,
And then
darkened into
the
a
first flakes
bruised,
began to
terrifying shade of purple.
This was not the gentle
and then
floating snow
the first
of a quiet
flakes began
winter
to
evening.
fall.
This
was not the gentle
jagged
floating
crystals
snow
of
of a
ice,
quiet winter
driven
evening.
horizontally by
These
a
were
screaming,
hard,
relentless
jagged
wind.
crystals of ice,
The white nightmare
driven
had fully
horizontally
awakened.
by a screaming, relentless
Within
wind.
minutes,
The
brutal
white
reality
nightmare
of
had
the
fully
Alps
awakened.
swallowed the entire
Within
army.
minutes,
The
the
narrow
brutal
path,
reality of the
barely
Alps
2 meters
swallowed
wide in
the
some
entire
stretches,
army.
disappeared
The narrow
completely
path,
beneath a
barely
rapidly
2 meters
accumulating
wide in
layer
some
of
stretches,
blinding white.
disappeared completely
The
beneath
snow
a
covered the
rapidly
shattered
accumulating
arrows.
layer of
It covered the
blinding white.
bloodstains on the rocks.
The snow covered
It
the
draped
shattered
a thick,
arrows.
beautiful,
It covered
and
the
utterly
bloodstains on
merciless
the
blanket
rocks.
over the bodies
It draped
of the
a
fallen
thick,
men and horses.
beautiful, an utterly merciless blanket over the bodies of the fallen men and horses, turning the chaotic aftermath of a battle into a landscape of terrifying purity.
Fresh snow is soft.
Listen to the terrifying physics of this environment.
It muffles the sounds
Fresh
of the world,
snow is soft.
creating a heavy,
It is deceptive.
deadened silence.
It muffles the sounds of the world,
powdery,
creating a heavy,
inviting surface
deadened silence.
lay the true trap.
But beneath that
Ancient,
powdery,
polished
inviting
blue
surface
ice that
lay
had
the
not
true
melted in
trap.
centuries.
Ancient,
When Surus
polished
forced
blue
his
ice
massive legs
that
to
had
move
not
forward,
melted in centuries.
you could hear the
When
agonizing
Surus
struggle
forced
of
his
gravity
massive
and
legs to
friction.
move forward,
First,
you
there
could
was
hear
heavy,
the
muffled
agonizing
crunch of
struggle
his
of
massive
gravity
foot,
and friction.
breaking through the soft
First,
upper crust
there was
of
the heavy,
snow.
muffled crunch of his
immediately
massive
following
foot,
that
breaking
was a
through the
sound that
soft
would make
upper
your
crust of
stomach
the
turn.
snow.
The
But immediately
high-pitched,
following
sickening
that
scrape
was a
of his
sound that
thick,
would make your
cracked
stomach turn.
toenails,
The
sliding
high-pitched,
uncontrollably
sickening
against the
scrape of his
frictionless
thick,
ice underneath.
cracked toenails, sliding
Every single
uncontrollably
step was a
against the
gamble
frictionless
with the
ice
abyss.
underneath.
To his right,
Every
sheer
single
drop
step
into the valley
was a
had
gamble
vanished,
with the abyss.
obscured entirely
To his
by
right,
a wall of
the sheer
swirling
drop
white.
into the valley had
One
vanished,
misstep,
obscured
one
entirely
sudden shift
by
in
a
balance
wall of
from the
swirling
heavy,
white.
frozen
One
wooden
misstep,
tower strapped to his
one
back,
sudden shift in
and
balance
thousands
from
of
the
pounds
heavy,
of flesh and
frozen
iron
wooden tower
would be
strapped
pulled
to his
down
back,
into the void.
and thousands of pounds of
biological
flesh and
toll on
iron
his body
would
was
be pulled
catastrophic.
down into the void.
The trunk of an elephant is
The
a miracle
biological
of
toll on
evolutionary
his body
engineering,
was catastrophic.
containing tens
The trunk of an
thousands
elephant is a
individual
miracle
muscles.
of evolutionary
In the
engineering,
wild, it is more
containing
sensitive,
tens of thousands
more
of
delicate
individual
than
muscles.
human fingers.
In the wild,
But in this
it is
sub-zero
more
hell,
sensitive,
that
more
incredible
delicate than human
sensitivity
fingers.
became an
But
excruciating
in this
curse.
sub-zero hell,
Surus
that
was
incredible
forced to use his
sensitivity
trunk
became an
to
excruciating
constantly probe the
curse.
ground ahead of him.
Surus was
blindly
forced to
sweeping
use
away
his
the
trunk
snow
to constantly
test the
probe the
stability
ground
of the
ahead of
ice
him,
before
blindly
committing his
sweeping
weight.
away the snow
With every touch,
to test the
the
stability
freezing
of the ice
temperature
before
violently
committing his
assaulted
weight.
the exposed
With every
nerve
touch,
endings.
the freezing
Slowly,
temperature
agonizingly,
violently assaulted
the
the
tip of his
exposed
trunk
nerve endings.
began to lose its
Slowly,
feeling. The
agonizingly,
deep, wrinkly folds
the
of
tip of his
ash-gray
trunk
skin
began to
meant
lose
to
its
hold
feeling.
cooling mud
The deep,
were now
wrinkly
packed
folds of
solid
his
with
ash-gray
jagged ice
skin
crystals.
meant to hold
Frostbite
cooling
crept
mud
in
were
silently.
now packed solid
The edges
with
of his
jagged ice
massive
crystals.
ears, designed to
Frostbite
catch the
crept
warm,
in
gentle
silently.
breezes of
The edges
African
of his
savanna
massive ears
were turning
designed
stiff,
to catch the
brittle,
warm, gentle
and black
breezes
at
of
the
the
edges.
African savanna,
And
were
still,
turning
he
stiff,
carried the iron.
brittle, and
The
black
armor
at
that
the
Hannibal's
edges.
men had strapped to his
And
belly
still, he
was
carried
no
the
longer
iron.
just drawing the heat
The
away
armor
from
that
his
Hannibal's
core.
men had strapped
It
to
had
his
frozen
belly
solid.
was no longer
The thick
just
leather
drawing the
belts
heat
had
away from his
rigidified
core.
into an
It had
agonizing,
frozen solid.
unyielding cage
The
of
thick
frost.
leather belts had
Every time
rigidified into
Surus
an
tried to draw a
agonizing,
deep breath of the
unyielding
thin,
cage of
freezing
frost.
mountain air,
Every time
his lungs
Surus
had
tried to
fight
draw a
against
deep
the
breath
icy
of the
constriction
thin,
of the
freezing
straps.
mountain air,
The metal
his
plates
lungs
clinked
had to
together,
fight against the
not with
icy
the sharp
constriction
ring
of the
bronze,
straps.
but with
The
the
metal
dull,
plates clinked
deadened
together,
thud of
not
solid
with the
ice
sharp ring of
striking
bronze,
solid ice.
but with the dull,
The
deadened
silence of a
thud of
blizzard
solid
is
ice
incredibly heavy.
striking solid
It swallows
ice.
the cries of the dying.
The silence of a
It
blizzard is
suffocates
incredibly
hope.
heavy.
The great
It swallows
Carthaginian
the cries
army,
of the dying.
once a roaring,
It suffocates
unstoppable
hope.
beast of
The
90,000
great Carthaginian
men,
army,
had been reduced
once a
to
roaring,
miserable,
unstoppable
crawling
beast
line
of
shivering
90,000
ghosts.
men, had been reduced
The mahouts,
to a miserable,
the men who
crawling
drove the
line
beasts,
of shivering
no
ghosts.
longer shouted commands.
The mahouts,
They no longer used
the
their
men who
bronze
drove the
hooks.
beasts,
Their own
no
hands
longer
were
shouted
too
commands.
too
They no
frozen
longer
to grip
used
the
their
weapons.
bronze hooks.
Instead,
their own
the
hands
man
were too
assigned to
numb,
Surus
too
simply
frozen to
leaned
grip
his
the weapons.
fragile, freezing
Instead,
body
the man
against the
assigned to
elephant's
Surus
massive,
simply
moving
leaned
leg.
his
The
fragile,
human
freezing
and the
body
beast,
against
once
the
master
elephant's
and
massive,
captive,
moving
were now
leg.
bound together
The
by a
human
desperate,
and the beast,
pathetic need
once master
to share
and captive,
whatever
were now
microscopic
bound
fraction of
together
body
by a
heat
desperate,
remained between
pathetic
them.
need to share
Surus did
whatever
not roar in
microscopic fraction
defiance.
of body
He
heat
did not
remained
thrash
between
in
them.
panic. As the
Surus
snow
did not
piled up
roar
on
in
his back,
defiance.
burying
He did
the
not
empty
thrash
wooden
in
tower,
panic.
he
As
simply
the snow
lowered his
piled
great
up on his
head.
back,
He closed
burying
his
the
eyes
empty
against
wooden
the blinding
tower,
wind.
he simply
Placing
lowered his
one
great
heavy,
head. He
freezing
closed
foot
his eyes
in front
against
of
the
the other,
blinding wind,
entering a
placing
deep,
one heavy,
meditative state
freezing
of
foot in
absolute
front of the other,
endurance. The
entering
world
a
had
deep,
gone completely
meditative
white,
state
and in
of
that
absolute
vast, freezing
endurance.
emptiness,
The
the only
world
thing
had gone
keeping him tethered
completely
to the
white,
world of the living,
and in that
was the
vast, freezing
agonizing,
emptiness,
painfully
the
slow
only thing
rhythm
keeping
of his
him
own
tethered to the
heartbeat.
world of the living
That was the
was
only
the
metronome
agonizing,
keeping
painfully
time
slow
in a
rhythm of
world his own
that had seemingly
heartbeat.
stopped spinning.
That was the
But
only
even that
metronome
slow,
keeping time
agonizing rhythm
in a world
was
that had
occasionally
seemingly
shattered
stopped
by the
spinning.
sounds of the dying.
But even that
It did
slow,
not happen all at
agonizing
once.
rhythm was
Death on
occasionally
a freezing
shattered by the
mountain
sounds of
is
the
rarely
dying.
a sudden
It did not
theatrical
happen
event.
all at once.
It is a slow,
Death on a
creeping
freezing
exhaustion,
mountain is
a
rarely a
gradual,
sudden
quiet
theatrical
surrender
event.
to the cold.
It is a slow,
The
creeping
first to fall
exhaustion,
among the great beasts
a gradual,
were the younger,
quiet
smaller
surrender to the
African
cold.
forest elephants.
The first to
They
fall
simply
among
did
the
not
great
possess
beasts
the
were the
immense
younger,
physical
smaller
mass of Surus
African forest
to sustain
elephants.
their core temperature.
They simply did not
against
possess the
relentless
immense
drain
physical
of the
mass of
sub-zero
Surus
winds.
to
Their
sustain
thinner
their core
skin,
temperature
stretched tight
against the
over shivering
relentless
ribs,
drain of the
offered
sub-zero
almost
winds.
no resistance.
Their thinner skin,
Try to visualize
stretched
the
tight over
heartbreaking
shivering ribs, offered almost no resistance.
It always began
Try
with a
to
subtle
visualize
slowing
the
of their
heartbreaking
gait,
physical
a
sequence
heavy,
of their collapse.
lethargic drag
It
of the
always
back
began
legs,
with a subtle
as if the
slowing
snow
of their
had
gait,
turned into thick,
a heavy,
hardening
lethargic
clay.
drag of
Then
the back
their
legs,
trunks,
as if the
usually
snow
coiled,
had turned into
alert,
thick, hardening
and intensely
clay.
expressive.
Then
would
their
go
trunks,
entirely limp.
usually coiled,
They dragged
alert,
pathetically
and
across the
intensely
sharp,
expressive,
ice-covered rocks,
would go entirely
leaving
limp.
faint,
They
erratic
dragged
trails of
pathetically
blood
across the
from
sharp,
frostbitten
ice-covered
flesh
rocks,
that were instantly
leaving faint,
erased by the falling
erratic
snow.
trails of blood from
The
frostbitten
mahouts,
flesh
desperate and
that were
terrified,
instantly erased
tried
by
to
the
beat them
falling
forward.
snow.
The dull,
The
sickening
mahouts,
thud of wooden
desperate and
handles,
terrified,
striking
tried to
frozen
beat
grey
them
hide,
forward. The
echoed
dull,
hollowly in
sickening
the thin
thud
air.
of wooden handles,
But the pain of the
striking
blows was
frozen
nothing
grey
compared
hide,
to the heavy,
echoed
numbing
hollowly in the
comfort
thin
of the
air.
snow.
But the
When
pain
an
of the
elephant of
blows
that
was
size
nothing
finally
compared to
gives
the
up,
heavy,
it doesn't
numbing
simply lay
comfort of
down.
the snow.
It collapses
When an
in
elephant of that
devastating
size finally
stages.
gives up,
First,
it doesn't simply
the front
lay
knees
down.
buckle,
It collapses
hitting the solid
in devastating
ice beneath the
stages.
snow with a heavy,
First, the front
bone-rattling
knees
crunch.
buckle,
A
hitting
deep,
the solid ice
wet,
beneath the snow
shuddering
with a
groan
heavy,
escapes their massive
bone-rattling
lungs.
crunch.
Then,
a deep,
the immense
wet,
hindquarters
shuddering groan
slowly yield
escapes
to
their
gravity.
massive lungs.
The iron armor
Then,
and the heavy
the
wooden
immense
howdah
hindquarters
twist violently
slowly
to the
yield
side,
to gravity.
digging deep into
the
the
iron
snowbank
armor and the heavy
as the
wooden
giant
howdah
finally comes
twist
to rest.
violently to the side,
For Surus,
digging deep into
walking
the
just a few
snowbank
dozen
as the
paces
giant
ahead in the
finally
blinding
comes to
whiteout.
rest.
He could
For
not see his
Surus,
fallen brethren.
walking just a few
The
dozen
fog and
paces
snow
ahead
were
in the
too
blinding
thick,
whiteout,
but he could feel
he could
them
not
leaving.
see his fallen brethren.
Elephants
The
possess
fog
a
and snow
profound,
were too
almost
thick,
telepathic
but he
spatial
could feel
awareness
them
of their
leaving.
herd. They are bound
Elephants
together
possess
by
a
an invisible
profound,
web
almost
of subsonic
telepathic
vibrations
spatial awareness
and
of their
deep,
herd.
ancient
They are
emotional
bound together by an
connections.
invisible
When
web
one of
of
those
subsonic
connections is
vibrations
suddenly severed,
and deep,
it leaves a
ancient
gaping
emotional
physical
connections.
void in their collective
When one of those
consciousness.
connections is suddenly
The most
severed,
haunting
it
part
leaves
of
a
the journey
gaping
was
physical
not the
void
sight
in
of
their
the frozen
collective
bodies,
consciousness.
but the sound of their
The most
descent.
haunting part of the
Some
journey
elephants
was not the
simply
sight of
froze
the
to
frozen
death on the
bodies,
narrow path,
but the sound
becoming
of their
massive,
descent.
tragic
Some elephants
roadblocks of
simply
ice and
froze
flesh
to death on the
that
narrow
the rest
path,
of the army had to
becoming
brutally
massive,
push past.
tragic
But
roadblocks of
others-
ice and
others
flesh
simply
that the rest of the army had to
Listen
brutally
closely
push
to the
past.
terrifying
But
physics of
others,
that moment.
others
It
simply
started
slipped.
with a sudden,
Listen
violent
closely
scraping
to the
of giant
terrifying
toenails,
physics of that
frantically
moment.
trying to find
It started
purchase
with a
against
sudden,
polished blue
violent
ice.
scraping of
Then,
giant toenails,
the
frantically trying to
high-pitched
find
trumpet of
purchase
pure,
against polished blue
unadulterated
ice.
terror,
Then,
slicing
the
through
frantic,
the howling wind,
high-pitched trumpet
and finally,
of pure,
a heavy,
unadulterated
sickening
terror,
scrape as thousands
slicing
of
through
pounds
the
of living
howling
flesh,
wind.
iron
And finally,
plates,
a
and
heavy,
splintering
sickening
wood
scrape as
slid off the
thousands of
edge of the
pounds of living
precipice.
flesh,
When it
iron
happened,
plates,
Surus
and
would
splintering
stop.
wood
His massive
slid off the
ears,
edge of the precipice.
stiff and brittle with
When it
frost,
happened,
would twitch
Surus
slightly,
would stop.
straining
His
against
massive
the wind
ears,
to listen.
stiff and
He could
brittle
hear
with
the
frost,
heavy metallic
would
crashing
twitch
of the
slightly,
howdah,
straining against the wind to
rock face
listen.
far, far below.
He could hear the heavy
He could hear
metallic
the
crashing of the
desperate echoing
howdah,
cries of his
shattering
kin,
against the
fading
rock
into the
face
deep,
far, far
foggy
below.
abyss.
He could hear the
Smaller and
desperate
smaller,
echoing cries of his
quieter
kin,
and quieter,
fading into the deep,
until there was
foggy
only the
abyss.
absolute,
Smaller and
indifferent,
smaller,
heavy
quieter
silence of the
and
falling
quieter,
snow.
until there was
If
only
you
the
are lying
absolute,
there right now,
indifferent,
with your eyes
heavy
closed,
silence of the
safe under
falling
your
snow.
blankets, try to
If you
feel
are
that
lying there right
profound,
now,
crushing
with your eyes
emptiness.
closed,
Imagine
safe
walking
under your
through a storm,
blankets,
and
try to
suddenly
feel that
realizing that
profound,
the giant,
crushing emptiness.
reassuring presence
Imagine
that walked
walking through a
beside you just
storm,
moments ago
and suddenly realizing that
simply
the giant,
gone,
reassuring
replaced
presence
by a
that
howling,
walked beside you just
empty
moments
vortex
ago
of white wind.
is simply
There are no
gone,
graves here,
replaced
no
by a
morning
howling,
rituals,
empty
just a
vortex
cold,
of white
calculating
wind.
subtraction
There
of
are no
life.
graves here,
Surus could
no
not
morning
understand
rituals,
the geopolitical
just a
reasons
cold,
for this
calculating
suffering.
subtraction
He
of
didn't
life.
know that these lives
Surus
were being
could not
spent
understand
like
the
cheap copper
geopolitical
coins
reasons for
to
this
buy
suffering.
a tactical advantage.
He didn't
over
know
the
that
Roman
these
legions.
lives were being
He
spent
only
like
knew that
cheap
the
copper
slow,
coins
comforting hum
to
of
buy
his
a
herd,
tactical
the
advantage
only
over the
family he
Roman
had ever
legions.
known,
He
was
only
dying
knew that
out,
the slow,
voice by
comforting hum
voice,
of his herd,
heartbeat by
the only
heartbeat.
family he had ever
As the
known,
days dragged
was
on
dying
into a
out,
blur of
voice
white
by
agony,
voice. The gaps in the
heartbeat by
marching
heartbeat
column grew wider.
as the days dragged
dragged
on
on
into
into
a
a blur of white
that
agony.
familiar,
The
earthy
gaps
musk
in the marching
that
column
once
grew
meant
wider.
safety, warmth,
The scent of
and
the herd,
belonging,
that
was
familiar,
being entirely
earthy musk
overwritten by the
that once
sterile,
meant safety,
metallic
warmth,
smell of
and
fresh
belonging,
snow and
was being
being
frozen
entirely
blood.
overwritten
The
by
deep,
the sterile,
rumbling
metallic
conversations
smell
beneath
of
the
fresh
earth
snow
fell
and
completely
frozen
silent.
blood. The
The
deep,
tragedy was not
rumbling
confined to the
conversations
animals.
beneath the earth
The humans who drove
fell
them were
completely
failing
silent.
just as rapidly.
The tragedy
The
was
mahout
not
who had ridden
confined to the
proudly on
animals.
Surus's neck
The
for
humans
months
who drove them
no
were
longer
failing
sat
just as
upright.
rapidly.
He now
The
lay
mahout who had
completely
ridden
flat
proudly on
against the
Surus's
elephant's
neck
freezing
for
skin.
months no
His
longer
arms
sat
wrapped
upright.
desperately around
He
the
now
thick,
lay completely
icy
flat
ropes of
against the
howdah,
elephant's freezing
entirely
skin.
unresponsive.
His arms wrapped
His lips were
desperately
blue.
around the thick,
His eyelashes
icy
caked
ropes
in
of the
heavy
howdah.
frost. entirely unresponsive. His lips were blue, his eyelashes caked in heavy frost. He had become just another inanimate piece of the agonizing burden Surus had to carry. Surus was becoming isolated, a solitary island of fading warmth in an endless ocean of ice. Yet, as the younger, faster elephants perished all around him, the scarred, one-tusked Syrian allowed him to hoard enough core heat to survive. Perhaps it was his sheer, unprecedented size that allowed him to hoard enough core heat to survive. Or perhaps,
a primal refusal to let this alien frozen mountain claim
unyielding stubbornness.
A primal refusal to let this alien frozen mountain claim his bones.
Place the heavy foot.
Every step
required a monumental negotiation with gravity. Place the heavy foot.
Breathe out a cloud of
the
steam.
immense weight.
Repeat.
Feel the ice
It was a meditation
underneath.
born of pure agony.
Breathe out a cloud of steam.
Down to the next
Repeat.
2 yards of snow.
It was a meditation
Nothing
born
else
of
existed.
pure agony.
Only the
world had
ever-widening,
narrowed down
terrifying
to the next
silence
2
of the
yards
herd
of snow.
that was no longer
Nothing
there.
else existed.
The ascent
Only
finally
the ever-widening,
breaks.
terrifying
The howling,
silence of the
relentless
herd
wind
that was no longer
tearing
there.
at their bodies for days.
The ascent
suddenly
finally breaks.
loses its upward
The
momentum.
howling, relentless
The ground
wind
levels
that has been
out.
tearing at
The
their
battered,
bodies for
freezing
days
column of the
suddenly
Carthaginian
loses
army
its upward
has
momentum.
reached the highest
The
point of
ground
the pass.
levels out.
The summit
The battered,
of the Alps.
freezing column of the
If you are
Carthaginian
listening to
army
this in the
has
warmth
reached
and
the
safety
highest
of your
point of the
room,
pass.
take a slow,
The summit
deep
of the
breath
Alps.
in. Hold
If you
it
are
for a
listening to
moment.
this in the
And
warmth
now,
and safety
let
of your
it out
room,
slowly.
take a slow,
Imagine
deep
that
breath in.
materializing
Hold
as
it
a
for a
thick
moment.
cloud of white
And now,
steam.
let
in
it
an
out
atmosphere
slowly.
so profoundly
Imagine
cold
that breath
that it hurts
materializing
simply
as
to
a thick
exist.
cloud of white steam.
This summit
in an
is not a
atmosphere
place of
so
triumph.
profoundly cold
It is not
that
a
it hurts
picturesque
simply to
mountaintop
exist.
where conquerors
This
plant
summit
their flags.
is not a place of
It is
triumph.
a desolate,
It is not a
windswept
picturesque
plateau
mountaintop
of jagged ice
where
and
conquerors
grey rock,
plant their flags.
completely devoid of
It
life.
is a desolate,
It is scattered with the
windswept
frozen
plateau
bodies of
of
men
jagged
and
ice
pack
and grey
mules
rock,
who survived
completely
the agonizing
devoid of
climb.
life.
Only
It
to
is
have
scattered
their
with the
hearts
frozen
simply give
bodies
out
of
the
men
moment they
and
stopped
pack
moving.
mules who
The
survived the
silence up
agonizing
here,
climb.
when the wind
Only to have
momentarily
their
dies
hearts
down,
simply give
is
out the
heavy
moment
and
they stopped
oppressive.
moving.
It is the
silence
profound
up here,
silence of an
when the
ancient
wind
tomb.
momentarily dies
Hannibal
down,
Barca,
is heavy
the
and
mastermind
oppressive.
of this
It
magnificent
is the
and
profound
terrible
silence
journey.
of an ancient
Walks to the
tomb.
edge of the southern
Hannibal
precipice.
Barca,
He
the
brushes the
mastermind
snow
of this
from his heavy
magnificent
cloak
and terrible
and points
journey,
his frostbitten
walks to the
hand
edge of the
downward.
southern precipice.
Below them,
He
visible
brushes the
only
snow
through
from his
brief,
heavy cloak
fleeting breaks
and points
in the
his
heavy,
frostbitten
swirling
hand
clouds.
downward.
Lies
Below
the Po
them,
River Valley
visible
of Italy,
only through brief,
a land
fleeting
of green
breaks in the
fields,
heavy,
flowing
swirling
water
clouds,
and warmth.
lies the Po River
He turns
Valley of
back to
Italy,
his shivering,
a land of
decimated
green
army.
fields,
He shouts
flowing
hoarse
water
words of
and
encouragement.
warmth.
His voice
He turns
cracking in the
back to
thin
his
air.
shivering,
He speaks of
decimated army.
unparalleled glory.
He shouts hoarse words of
speaks
encouragement.
bloody vengeance
His voice
against the
cracking
Roman
in the thin
Republic.
air.
He points
speaks
to the
of
distant
unparalleled
green
glory.
horizon and
He speaks
promises
of a
his
bloody
starving
vengeance
men
against the
that
Roman
worst
Republic.
is over.
He points to
riches
the
of the
distant
world,
green
he tells them,
horizon
are
and
waiting
promises
just
his
down the
starving
mountain.
men that the worst
For the
is over.
surviving soldiers,
The riches of the
that
world, he
distant,
tells them,
hazy
are
patch of
waiting
green
just down the
is a
mountain.
lifeline.
For
It
the
is a
surviving
visual
soldiers,
anchor that
that
forces their
distant,
freezing
hazy
blood
patch of
to
green
pump once
is a
more.
lifeline.
They raise
It
their
is a
weapons.
visual anchor
They cheer.
that forces
It
their
is a
freezing
weak,
blood
ragged,
to pump
pathetic
once more.
sound.
They
Swallowed
raise their
almost
weapons
instantly by the
they
vast,
cheer.
indifferent
It is a
emptiness
weak,
of the mountain
ragged,
range.
pathetic sound.
But if you shift
swallowed
your gaze
almost
away from the
instantly by the
shouting men,
vast,
you will
indifferent
see a
emptiness of the
profound
mountain
contrast.
range.
Standing a few yards
But if you
away
shift
from
your
the edge of
gaze
the
away
cliff,
from the shouting
Surus
men,
does not
you will
share
see
in
a
this sudden
profound
wave of
contrast.
human elation.
Standing a few yards
Glory
away
is
from
a
the edge
human
of the cliff,
invention.
Surus does not
Vengeance is a
share
bitter
in this
poison that
sudden
only
wave
men
of
choose
human
to drink.
elation.
For a
Glory
giant
is a
Syrian
human
bull
invention.
elephant,
Vengeance is a bitter poison that only men
means
choose to
absolutely
drink.
nothing.
For a
He does
giant
not need
Syrian
the wealth
bull
of Rome.
elephant, a
He just
distant
needs a
view of
patch
an
of
enemy
warm
valley
earth.
means
He needs the
absolutely
sun.
nothing. He does not
Surus
need the
does
wealth
not even
of
look
Rome.
down into
He
the
just
valley.
needs a patch of
His
warm
massive
earth.
head,
He
heavy
needs
with
the
thick
sun.
layers of frost,
Surus
and the crushing
does not
weight of
even look
exhaustion
down into the
hangs
valley.
dangerously
His
low.
massive head,
His one
heavy
remaining
with thick
tusk,
layers of frost,
capped in
and the
dull,
crushing
scratched
weight of
bronze,
exhaustion,
points
hangs
downward,
dangerously
nearly
low.
resting against
His
the
one
icy
remaining
crust of the
tusk,
ground.
capped in
The
dull,
heavy wooden
scratched
tower
bronze,
strapped to his
points
back
downward,
leans
nearly
precariously
resting
to
against
the
the
left.
icy crust
The
of the
thick
ground.
leather belt securing
The heavy
it have
wooden
stretched,
tower strapped to his
frozen,
back
and
leans
deformed under the
precariously
immense
to the
weight
left.
and constant
The thick leather
moisture,
belt
cutting
securing
deep,
it have stretched,
agonizing
frozen,
grooves into his
and
raw
deformed
hide.
under the immense
The
weight
iron plates
and constant
on his belly,
moisture,
meant to
cutting
protect him
deep,
from spears,
agonizing
are now
grooves
caked
into
in
his
a
raw
thick layer
hide.
of dirty,
The iron plates on his
blood-stained
belly,
rime.
meant to
They
protect
are
him from
heavy,
spears,
freezing weights
are now
pulling him
caked in a
toward the
thick
grave.
layer of dirty,
slowly, blood-stained rime.
He lifts
They
the
are
tip of
heavy,
his
freezing
trunk.
weights, pulling him
The
toward the
appendage,
grave.
once so
Slowly,
incredibly agile,
painfully,
capable
he
of
lifts the
plucking
tip
a single
of his freezing
blade of
trunk
grass from the savannah.
The appendage,
now moves
once so
with the
incredibly
stiff,
agile,
jerky motion
capable
of a
of
dying
plucking a
branch in the
single
wind.
blade of grass
He
from the
reaches out
savannah,
blindly.
now
He
moves
brushes
with the
the
stiff,
trembling tip against
jerky
a jagged
motion of a
rock
dying
protruding
branch
from
in the
deep
wind.
snow.
He reaches out
He is not
blindly.
looking for a
He
tactical
brushes the
advantage.
trembling tip
He is
against a
simply
jagged
looking
rock
for a
protruding
familiar
from the
scent,
deep snow.
a trace of sweet
He is not
roots,
looking for a tactical
hint of familiar
advantage.
soil.
He is simply
But there is
looking for a
nothing.
familiar
The
scent,
mountain offers
a trace of
absolutely
sweet
nothing.
roots,
There is
a
only
hint
the
of familiar
sterile,
soil,
metallic smell
but
of
there is
frozen
nothing.
water.
The mountain
sharp
offers
tang of wet
absolutely
iron,
nothing.
and the
There is only
lingering
the
heavy scent
sterile
of
metallic
death
smell
that
of
clings
frozen
to the
water,
army.
the sharp
His dark
tang of wet
amber
iron,
eyes,
and the
usually
lingering
so
heavy
intensely
scent of
expressive
death
and
that
observant,
clings to the
have
army.
glazed over into
His
a state
dark
of
amber
profound
eyes,
emptiness.
usually so
blinks
intensely
slowly.
expressive and
The heavy,
observant, have
frost-covered
glazed
lashes
over into a
struggling
state
to
of
part and
profound
close.
emptiness.
He is
He
completely
blinks
alone
slowly.
now.
The heavy,
36 other
frost-covered
elephants that
lashes
began this
struggling
journey
to
with
part
him
and close
have all been swallowed
He is
by the
completely
white
alone
nightmare.
now. The
He is the
36
last of his
other
kind,
elephants that began this
standing on
journey
this
with
frozen
him
roof of
have
the
all been
world.
swallowed by the
A
white
solitary
nightmare.
ghost, trapped
He is
in a
the last
war
of his
that is
kind,
not his own.
standing on this frozen
As
roof
Hannibal's
of the world.
voice continues to
A solitary
echo off the
ghost,
canyon walls,
trapped in a war
promising
that
an
is not
empire
his
to
own.
his freezing men,
As Hannibal's
Surus
voice
lets out a
continues to
long,
echo off the
shuddering
canyon
sigh.
walls,
A massive
promising an
cloud of
empire
thick
to his
white
freezing
steam
men,
erupts from his
Surus
trunk,
lets out a
rolling
long,
over the ice
shuddering
before
sigh.
dissipating into the
A
grey
massive
void.
cloud of thick
It is
white
not a
steam
sound of
erupts
defiance.
from his trunk,
It is
rolling
not a
over
roar
the
of
ice
strength.
before
It is the
dissipating into the grey
heartbreaking
void.
sound of an ancient,
It is not a sound of
weary
defiance.
soul, except
It is
in the
not a
heavy,
roar of strength.
brutal burden
It is the
of a
heartbreaking
destiny
sound
he
of
did
an
not
ancient,
choose.
weary
The
soul,
humans believe
accepting
they have
the
conquered
heavy,
the mountain.
brutal
They look at
burden
the downward
of
slope
a destiny he
and
did
believe
not
the
choose.
hardest part of the journey
The humans
is behind
believe
them,
they have
but
conquered
they
the
are
mountain.
entirely,
They look at the
devastatingly
downward
wrong.
slope and
Climbing
believe
up
the
a mountain
hardest
is a
part of the
brutal
journey
test of
is behind
endurance.
them.
But
But they are
climbing down,
entirely,
descending a
devastatingly
steep,
wrong.
frictionless cliff
Climbing
face
up a
with
mountain is
thousands
a
of pounds
brutal
of
test
dead
of
weight
endurance.
strapped to your back.
But climbing
That
down,
is a terrifying
descending a
battle
steep,
against the laws of
frictionless
physics
cliff face
themselves.
with thousands of
The
pounds
true
of
terror
dead weight
the
strapped
Alps
to your back.
is not the slow
That is a
climb upward.
terrifying battle
It is
against
the
the
sudden,
laws of physics
violent
themselves.
pull of gravity
The true
downward.
terror of the Alps
And as
is
Surus
not the
shifts
slow
his
climb
massive
upward.
weight,
It is the
preparing to
sudden,
follow the cheering
violent
men
pull of
and
gravity
take his first
downward.
heavy step.
And
down
as
the
Surus
southern
shifts
face of
his
the
massive
mountain,
weight,
the ice
preparing
beneath
to
his front
follow the
foot
cheering men
gives a sharp,
and take his first
terrifying
heavy
crack.
step down the southern
That
face of the
sound,
mountain,
a deep,
the ice beneath
resonant
his front
fracture,
foot gives a
echoing through
sharp,
the heavy mist,
terrifying crack.
is the true voice of the Alps.
That sound,
It is
a
a
deep,
reminder that
resonant
while climbing a
fracture
mountain
echoing
is a
through the
grueling
heavy
test of
mist,
endurance,
is the true
descending
voice of
it
the Alps.
is a terrifying
It is a reminder
negotiation
that
with
while
gravity.
climbing a mountain is a
If you are
grueling
lying
test of
there,
endurance,
perfectly still,
descending
I
it
want you to
is a
imagine the
terrifying
sheer
negotiation
physical
with
horror
gravity.
of walking down a steep,
If you are lying
icy
there,
incline,
perfectly still,
with thousands
I
of
want you to
pounds strapped
imagine
to
the
your
sheer
back.
physical
On
horror
flat ground,
of walking down
an
a
elephant's
steep,
weight is
icy
perfectly
incline
distributed
with
across
thousands of
four
pounds
massive,
strapped to your back.
pillar-like legs.
On flat
But
ground,
on a severe
an
downward
elephant's
slope,
weight is
the physics
perfectly
of their own
distributed
bodies turn
across
against them.
four massive,
The immense
pillar-like
bulk of
legs.
Surus's
But on a
hindquarters
severe
is
downward
constantly
slope,
pushing
the
forward,
physics of their own
forcing
bodies
his front
turn
legs
against
to
them.
act as desperate,
The immense bulk of
trembling
Surus's
brakes against the
hindquarters
frictionless
is
ice.
constantly pushing forward,
Every time he takes
forcing
a
his
step
front
downward,
legs to act
the
as
heavy wooden
desperate,
howdah
trembling
strapped to his
brakes
spine
against the frictionless
shifts
ice.
violently forward.
Every
The
time
freezing
he
leather
takes a
belts
step
dig into
downward,
the soft,
the heavy
raw
wooden
skin
howdah
just
strapped to
behind
his
his
spine
front legs
shifts
threatening
violently
to tear
forward.
his flesh open.
The freezing leather
The heavy
belts
iron
dig into
armor
the soft,
plates
raw
clank
skin
against his
just
knees.
behind his front
He
legs,
has to lean
threatening
incredibly
to
far
tear
back,
his flesh open.
keeping his center
The
of
heavy
gravity
iron armor
dangerously
plates
low,
clank
dragging
against his
hind
knees.
legs behind
He
him
has to lean
in a
incredibly
desperate
far
attempt
back,
to create
keeping his
friction.
center of
But
gravity
suddenly,
dangerously
the
low,
agonizing
dragging his
procession
hind legs
grinds to a
behind him
complete halt.
in a desperate
The
attempt
narrow,
to
winding
create
path
friction.
they have been following
But suddenly,
simply
the
ceases to
agonizing
exist.
procession
A
grinds to a
recent
complete
avalanche,
halt.
triggered
The
perhaps
narrow,
by the
winding
sheer weight of
path
the
they have
army
been
passing
following
above,
simply
has
ceases to
completely
exist.
sheared off the side
A
of the
recent
mountain.
avalanche,
Before
triggered
them
perhaps by the
lies a
sheer weight of the army
vertical
passing
drop
above,
into the fog.
has completely completely sheared off the side of the mountain.
Blocked by a massive,
Before them
solid
lies a
wall of
sheer,
ancient,
vertical
jagged
drop
stone
into the fog.
that the landslide
The only way
has
forward
exposed.
is blocked by a
They are
massive,
trapped.
solid
There is
wall
no
of
room to
ancient,
turn around.
jagged stone
To their left
that the landslide has
is the freezing cliff
exposed.
face. To their
They
right
are trapped.
is the void.
There is no room
And
to turn
standing
around.
there, trapped
To their
on a
left
ledge barely
is the
wide
freezing
enough for
cliff
his own
face.
feet.
To their
Surus
right is
begins
the
to
void.
slowly
And standing
inevitably
there,
freeze
trapped
to
on a
death.
ledge barely wide
He
enough
cannot
for his
move
own
to
feet,
generate heat.
Surus
The
begins
wind is
to
howling
slowly,
directly into his
inevitably,
face. His massive
freeze to
ears are
death.
completely rigid.
He cannot
the
move
edges
to
turning a
generate
sickening
heat.
dead black.
The wind is howling
He lowers
directly
his head,
into his face.
tucking his trunk
His massive
tightly
ears
between
are
his front
completely
legs,
rigid, the
entering a
edges turning a
catatonic
sickening
state of
dead
pure
black.
preservation.
He lowers his
He is
head,
entirely at the
tucking his
mercy
trunk
of the
tightly
fragile
between his front
two-legged
legs,
creatures scrambling
entering a
around him.
catatonic
If they
state of
cannot
pure
find a way through
preservation.
the stone,
He is entirely at the
become just
mercy of the
another frozen
fragile
monument
two-legged
on this
creatures
cursed
scrambling
peak.
around him.
But humans
if they
possess
cannot
a
find a way
terrifying,
through the stone,
destructive
he will become
ingenuity
just another
that nature
frozen
simply
monument
cannot
on this cursed
comprehend.
peak.
Listen
But humans
closely to
possess
the
a
strange,
terrifying,
unnatural
destructive
sounds
ingenuity
that begin to
that
cut
nature
through the
simply
howling
cannot
wind.
comprehend.
It is not the sound
Listen
of swords
closely
or
to the
shields.
strange,
It is the
unnatural
rhythmic, frantic
sounds
chopping
that
of
begin
wood.
to cut through the
Hannibal's
howling
engineers
wind.
are desperately
It is not the
cutting
sound
down
of swords or
sparse, freezing
shields.
pine trees
It is the
clinging to
rhythmic,
cliffside.
frantic chopping of
They
wood.
are piling the logs
Hannibal's
directly
engineers are
against the massive
desperately
boulder
cutting down the
blocking their
sparse,
path.
freezing pine
And
trees
then,
clinging to the
smell of
cliffside.
smoke.
They are piling the
It
logs
starts as a
directly
faint,
against the
acrid
massive
wisp,
boulder blocking
quickly
their path.
swallowed by the blizzard.
And then,
But the men
the smell of
persist.
smoke.
They blow frantically
It
onto the
starts
embers
as a faint,
until a
acrid
roaring
wisp,
fire erupts
quickly
against
swallowed
the
by the
stone.
blizzard.
For
But the men
Surus,
persist.
standing just
They
a
blow
few yards
frantically
away,
onto the embers
the sudden blast
until a
of
roaring
heat is both a
fire
blessing
erupts against the
and
stone.
a terror.
For
The flames
Surus,
dance wildly
standing
in the
just a
wind,
few yards
casting
away,
long,
the
demonic
sudden blast
shadows
of
across
heat is
the white
both a
snow.
blessing
The
and a
ice
terror.
caked onto his
The
iron
flames
armor
dance
begins to
wildly
melt,
in the wind,
sending
casting
freezing
long,
streams of
demonic
water
shadows
running
across
down
the
his
white
raw
snow.
skin.
The
He
ice
watches
caked
with
onto his
dull,
iron
exhausted
armor begins
eyes
to melt,
as the rock face
sending
begins to
freezing
glow a
streams of
dull,
water
angry
running down
red
his
from the
raw
intense
skin.
heat.
He
The
watches
stone
with
itself is
dull,
groaning,
exhausted eyes
expanding
as the rock
unnaturally.
face begins to glow
But
a
fire
dull,
is not
angry
enough to
red
break
from
the
the
mountain.
intense heat.
What happens
The stone
next
itself
is
is
a
groaning,
detail so bizarre
expanding
that
unnaturally.
history has debated
But
it for
fire
over
is
2
not enough
millennia.
to break the mountain.
Hannibal's men bring
What happens
forward
next
heavy clay
is a
amphorae,
detail so bizarre
but they are not filled
that
with
history has
water.
debated it
They
for
are
over
filled
2
with cheap
millennia.
military
Hannibal's
rations of
men
wine
bring forward
that have
heavy
long
clay
since turned to
amphorae,
sharp,
but they are
acidic
not
vinegar.
filled with water.
Imagine the
They are filled
overwhelming
with cheap
sensory shock
military
of this
rations
moment.
of wine
The men
that have
hurl
long
the clay
since turned
pots
to
directly
sharp,
onto the
acidic
glowing,
vinegar.
red-hot rock.
Imagine the overwhelming
The sound is
sensory
deafening.
shock of this
A
moment.
violent,
The
explosive
men hurl
hiss
the clay
tears
pots
through the
directly
air
onto the
as
glowing,
the cold acid
red-hot
makes
rock.
contact with the
The sound is
superheated stone.
deafening. A
massive
violent,
cloud of
explosive
stinging,
hiss
suffocating
tears through the
steam
air as
erupts
the
into
cold
the
acid
narrow
makes
pass.
contact with the
smell
superheated
is
stone.
abhorrent.
A
choking
massive
mixture of
cloud of
burning
stinging,
wood,
suffocating
sulphurous
steam
rock,
erupts
and
into the
boiling
narrow
sour
pass.
acid
The
that
smell
burns
is
the inside
abhorrent.
of Surus's
A choking
sensitive
mixture
trunk.
of burning wood,
The sudden
sulphurous rock,
catastrophic
and
shift in
boiling
temperature,
sour acid
combined
that
with the
burns
chemical
the
bite
inside
of
of
the vinegar,
Surus's sensitive
is too
trunk.
much for the ancient stone.
The sudden,
With a sound
catastrophic
like a
shift in
thunderclap,
temperature,
the massive
combined
boulder
with the chemical
fractures.
bite of the vinegar,
Deep,
is
jagged
too much
cracks
for the
run
ancient
violently
stone.
through the rock face.
With a sound like a thunderclap,
Then comes the iron.
the massive boulder
the engineers,
fractures.
their faces
Deep,
black with
jagged
soot and
cracks
wrapped
run
in
violently
freezing
through the
rags,
rock face.
rush forward with heavy
Then comes the
bronze and
iron
pickaxes.
The engineers, their
Listen to
faces
the
black
grueling,
with soot and
desperate
wrapped
rhythm
in
of
freezing
survival.
rags,
Clang,
rush forward with
clang,
heavy bronze and
crack.
iron pickaxes.
The sharp metallic strikes
Listen to the
ring out
grueling,
against the
desperate
weakened
rhythm
stone.
of survival.
They are literally
Clang,
carving a new
clang,
path out of the sheer
crack.
cliff.
The
Step
sharp
by
metallic
agonizing
strikes
step,
ring out against the
fueled by
weakened
nothing
stone.
but adrenaline.
They are literally
starving
carving a new
desperation,
path out of the
and
sheer
the sheer
cliff,
terror of
step by
dying in the
agonizing
snow.
step,
For 3
fueled
days
by
and
nothing
3
but
nights
adrenaline,
they dig.
starving
And for 3
desperation,
days and 3 nights,
and the sheer terror
Surus
of dying
stands
in the
perfectly
snow.
still on the
For
freezing
3
ledge.
days and 3 nights they
This
dig.
is the profound,
And for
quiet
3 days
tragedy
and
of the
3
beast of
nights,
burden.
Surus
Surus
stands
possesses
perfectly
the
still
strength
on
to
the
uproot
freezing
a
ledge.
tree, to crush a
This
chariot
is the
beneath his
profound,
foot,
quiet
to
tragedy
toss
of
a
the
fully
beast of
armored
burden.
man through the air.
Surus possesses
Yet
the strength
his
to
survival
uproot
is
a tree,
entirely
to
dependent
crush
on
a
the
chariot
chaotic,
beneath his
frantic
foot,
digging of
to
the
toss
tiny
a
men
fully
before
armored
him.
man through
He
the air.
simply waits.
Yet
His
his
massive
survival is
heart
entirely
beats slower
dependent on
and
the
slower,
chaotic,
a
frantic
dying drum
digging
in
of
a
the
white
tiny men
desert.
before him.
When the path
He
is
simply
finally
waits.
cleared,
His
it is
massive
not a
heart
gentle
beats
slope.
slower
It is
and
a steep,
slower, a
jagged
dying
ramp
drum
of
in a
freshly
white
shattered
desert.
rock.
When
and
the
loose
path is
gravel,
finally cleared,
plunging
it is not a
downward
gentle
at a
slope.
terrifying angle.
It is a steep, jagged
Mahout,
ramp of freshly
barely
shattered
clinging to
rock
life himself,
and
loose gravel,
weakly taps
plunging
the bronze
downward
hook against
at a
Surus's
terrifying angle.
frost-covered skull.
The mahout, barely clinging to life
opens his
himself,
glazed eyes.
weakly taps
He
the
looks
bronze
down at
hook
the
against
treacherous,
Surus's
unstable
frost-covered
ramp
skull.
of sharp stones.
Move.
He is
Surus
exhausted
opens
beyond
his
the
glazed
capacity
eyes.
of human language
He
to
looks down at the
describe.
treacherous,
But slowly,
unstable
he shifts
ramp
his
of
immense
sharp
weight.
stones.
He lifts
He
a
is
heavy,
exhausted
bleeding
beyond the
foot
capacity
and
of human
places it
language to
blindly into
describe.
the hands of the
But
men who
slowly,
have led him
he
into
shifts
hell,
his immense weight.
hoping with
He
every
lifts a
ounce
heavy,
of his
bleeding
fading
foot
life that
and
the
places
stone
it
will
blindly
hold.
into the hands
The
of the
stone
men
did
who have led
hold,
him into hell,
but the price of that
hoping
descent was a
with every
staggering,
ounce of his fading life
incomprehensible loss
that
of
the
life.
stone will hold.
When the shattered remnants
stone
of the
did
Carthaginian
hold,
army,
but the price of
finally
that
stumbled
descent
out
was
of
a
the heavy
staggering,
pine forests of the
incomprehensible
foothills.
loss of life.
The world suddenly
When the
changed.
shattered remnants of the
blinding
Carthaginian
whiteout
army
of the blizzard
finally stumbled
dissolved
out
into
of
a
the heavy
thick,
pine
damp
forests of the
morning
foothills,
mist.
the world
agonizing,
suddenly changed.
frictionless ice
The blinding
beneath their
whiteout of the
bleeding
blizzard
feet gave way to
dissolved
the
into a
soft,
thick, damp
dark and
morning
forgiving
mist.
soil of the
The
Po Valley.
agonizing,
If you are
frictionless
lying
ice
there in
beneath
the
their
quiet
bleeding
dark,
feet gave way to the soft,
imagine the
dark
sudden,
and forgiving soil of the Po
rush
Valley.
of rich oxygen.
If you are lying there in the quiet dark,
starving in
take
the
a
thin
deep
mountain
breath.
air for weeks.
Imagine the profound,
overwhelming rush of rich
painful
oxygen
sensory shock of
filling
smelling
lungs
damp
that have
earth,
been starving in the
leaves,
thin mountain
and
air
sweet
for
valley
weeks.
grass.
Imagine the
breathing nothing
profound,
but the sterile,
almost
metallic
painful
scent of
sensory
frozen
shock of
water
smelling damp
and
earth.
death. Rotting
They
leaves
had made it to
and
Italy.
sweet valley grass,
But victory is
after
a word
breathing
invented
nothing
by
but the sterile
politicians,
metallic
not
scent
by
of
those who
frozen
actually
water
walk the
and
path
death.
of war.
They had
The
made
army
it to
that
Italy,
poured into the valley
but
was not a
victory is a
conquering
word
force.
invented by politicians,
They were an army of
not
walking
by those who
corpses.
actually walked
Out
the
of the
path of
vast,
war.
roaring
The
machine
army
of
that
nearly
poured into the valley was not a
100,000 men
conquering force.
who had begun the
They
journey
were an
in
army of
Iberia.
walking corpses.
More than half had been
out of the
swallowed
vast,
by the Alps.
roaring
They
machine
left
of
their
nearly
bones on the jagged
100,000
cliffs,
men who had
preserved
begun the
forever
journey
in
in
the ice.
Iberia. More than
And the
half had
elephants,
been swallowed by the
the
Alps.
magnificent,
They left their
terrifying
bones on the
beasts of
jagged
war
cliffs,
that Hannibal
preserved
had brought
forever in
to
the
shatter
ice.
the psychological resolve
And the
of
elephants,
the Roman Republic.
the magnificent,
Look at their
terrifying
ranks now.
beasts of war
37
that Hannibal had
colossal
brought
animals
to shatter
had
the
marched
psychological
proudly into the
resolve
shadow
of the
of the
Roman
mountains.
Republic.
When they finally
Look at their
reached
ranks
the flatlands
now.
of northern Italy,
37 colossal
the deep,
animals
rumbling hum
had
of their
marched
herd was
proudly into
completely
the shadow
gone.
of the mountains.
You could count the
when they
survivors
finally
on a
reached
single
the
hand.
flatlands of northern
Just
Italy,
a few skeletal,
the deep,
shivering
rumbling
ghosts,
hum of their herd
dragging
was
their
completely
frostbitten
gone.
limbs through the mud.
You could count the
And
survivors on
towering
a
above
single
them all,
hand.
still
Just a few
carrying the
skeletal,
crushing weight of
shivering
the wooden
ghosts,
tower,
dragging
was
their
Surus.
frostbitten limbs through the mud.
Why did he survive?
And towering
How
above
did
them
a
all,
creature born in
still
the scorching,
carrying the
dusty
crushing
plains
weight of the wooden
Syria
tower,
outlast
was
the younger,
Surus.
seemingly more
Why
resilient
did he survive?
African elephants?
How did a creature born in the
Biologists might tell
scorching,
you
dusty
it was a
plains of
matter of
Syria
simple,
outlast the
brutal
younger,
physics.
seemingly
As a
more
Syrian
resilient
bull,
African elephants?
Surus possessed an
Biologists
unprecedented,
might tell you
massive
it was
volume.
a matter of simple,
His sheer size
brutal physics.
allowed his body to hoard
As a
tiny,
Syrian bull,
deep reservoir
Surus
of core
possessed
heat,
an
burning through
unprecedented,
his own muscle
massive
and fat
volume.
reserves at
His
a
sheer
slightly
size
slower rate
allowed
than
his body
smaller
to
kin.
hoard a tiny,
Historians
deep
might
reservoir
argue
of core heat,
it was his position
burning
in the
through his
marching
own
column,
muscle and fat
or the
reserves
desperate,
at a
frantic
slightly
care
slower
of his
rate
mahout.
than his smaller kin.
But if you look
Historians
closely
might
into the
argue
deep,
it was his
ancient
position in the
amber of his
marching column,
eyes,
or the
you might see
desperate,
a different
frantic
truth.
care of his mahout.
Survival in the face
But
of
if you look
absolute
closely into the
annihilation
deep,
requires
ancient
more
amber
than
of
just
his
physical
eyes,
mass.
you might see
It
a different
requires
truth.
a quiet,
Survival in the
unyielding
face of
stubbornness,
absolute
a primal
annihilation
refusal to surrender
requires
to the
more
mountain.
than just physical
Surus
mass.
had simply locked
It
his mind
requires
away
a quiet,
in a dark,
unyielding
quiet
stubbornness,
place,
a
enduring the
primal
torture of the
refusal to
present
surrender
moment
to the mountain.
by focusing entirely
Surus
on
had
the
simply
rhythmic,
locked his mind
heavy
away
thud of his
in
own
a dark,
heartbeat.
quiet place,
One step,
enduring the
then
torture
another,
of the present
until
moment
the mountain
by
ran out of
focusing
steps.
entirely on the
But
rhythmic,
surviving the
heavy
Alps
thud
did
of
not
his
mean
own
he
heartbeat.
emerged unscathed.
One step,
The giant
then
that
another,
walked into the Po
until
Valley
the mountain
was a
ran
ruined
out of
masterpiece
steps.
of nature.
But surviving the Alps
Listen to
did
the
not mean he
terrifying
emerged
symphony of his
unscathed.
movement now.
The giant
The
that
heavy
walked into the
iron
Po
armor
Valley
plates,
was a
once
ruined
meant to
masterpiece
reflect
of
the sun
nature.
and intimidate
Listen
the
to the
enemy,
terrifying
were
symphony
deeply
of his
rusted,
movement now.
stained with a dark,
The heavy
freezing
iron
mixture
armor
of pine
plates,
sap,
once
and
meant
his
to
own
reflect
dried
the sun
blood.
and
The thick
intimidate
leather
the
belts
enemy,
securing the
were
howdah
deeply
to his
rusted,
back had
stained
frozen
with a
and thawed
dark,
so many
freezing
times
mixture
they
of
had
pine
permanently
sap
deformed,
and his own dried
cutting
blood.
deep,
The
weeping
thick leather
trenches
belts
into the
securing the
thick grey
howdah
hide
to his
behind
back
his
had
shoulders.
frozen and
His
thawed
ears,
so many times
those
they had
magnificent,
permanently deformed,
expressive wings
cutting
of
deep,
flesh,
weeping
were ruined.
trenches into the
The edges
thick
were
grey
jagged,
hide behind
brittle,
his shoulders.
and black from severe
His ears,
frostbite.
those
The tip of his
magnificent,
long trunk,
expressive
his
wings
most
of
vital and
flesh,
sensitive
were
organ,
ruined.
was
The
heavily
edges were
scarred and
jagged,
numb.
brittle, and
Every
black
time
from
he tried
severe
to reach
frostbite.
down to pluck a
The tip
handful
of his
the
long
sweet,
trunk,
alien
his most
Italian
vital and
grass,
sensitive
you
organ,
could see a
was
slight,
heavily scarred and
uncontrollable
numb.
tremor in his
Every
muscles.
time he tried to reach
He
down
was
to pluck a
starving.
handful of the
His
sweet,
massive ribs
alien
pushed
Italian
sharply
grass,
against his
you
skin,
could see a slight,
casting deep,
uncontrollable
hollow
tremor in
shadows
his
along
muscles.
flanks.
Yet,
he was starving.
He did not gorge
his
himself
massive
on the
ribs pushed
vegetation.
sharply against his
He
skin.
ate slowly,
casting deep,
mechanically,
hollow shadows
his
along his
movements
flanks.
heavy with a profound,
Yet, he did not
lingering
gorge
exhaustion
himself on the
that
vegetation.
seeped into the very marrow
He ate
of his
slowly,
bones. Mechanically,
The
his
relationship
movements
between
heavy
the
with a
beast
profound,
and the men around him
lingering
began to
exhaustion
subtly shift.
that seeped into
The
the very
soldiers,
marrow of his
the
bones.
hardened Numidian cavalry,
The relationship
the
between
fierce
the
Celtic
beast and the men
mercenaries,
around him
the
began to
disciplined
subtly
Iberian
shift.
infantry,
The
they soldiers,
They no longer looked
the hardened
at Surus
Numidian
with mere
cavalry,
utilitarian
the
detachment.
fierce Celtic mercenaries,
When a man has stared
the disciplined
into the absolute
Iberian
void of death
infantry,
and survived,
they no longer
he forms
looked
a
at Surus
strange,
with mere
unspoken
utilitarian
bond with anyone
detachment.
or anything.
When a man has stared into the
crawled out of that
absolute
same
void of
void
death
beside
and
him,
survived,
as
he
Surus
forms a
plodded
strange,
slowly through the
unspoken
muddy
bond with
encampment.
anyone,
Exhausted
or
men
anything,
wrapped in filthy,
that
torn
crawled out of
blankets
that same
would
void
simply
beside
stop
him.
and stare.
As Surus
Some
plodded
would reach
slowly
out with
through the muddy
trembling,
encampment,
frost-scarred hands
exhausted
to
men wrapped
gently
in
touch
filthy,
his rusted
torn
iron
blankets
plates as he
would
passed.
simply stop and stare.
He was no longer
Some
just
would
a
reach out
tactical
with
asset.
trembling,
To the
frost-scarred
freezing,
hands
traumatized
to gently
soldiers of
touch his
Carthage,
rusted iron
this
plates as he
scarred,
passed.
one-tusked
He
giant
was no longer
had
just a
become
tactical
living,
asset
breathing monument
to the freezing,
to their own
traumatized
impossible
soldiers of
endurance.
Carthage.
If
This
this creature,
scarred,
heavily
one-tusked
armored,
giant
starving,
had become
and
a
out of his
living,
natural
breathing
element,
monument
could survive
to
the
their
wrath
own
of the gods
impossible
on the
endurance,
mountains, then
if this
perhaps they could
creature,
survive the
heavily
wrath of
armored,
Rome in the
starving,
valley, and out of his natural element, could survive the wrath of the gods on the mountain, then perhaps they could survive the wrath of Rome in the valley.
His siege engines.
Even Hannibal Barca, the man who had orchestrated this magnificent
Surus.
tragedy,
The elephant
recognized
became
the
the
shift.
anchor point
He had
for a
lost his
deeply
siege
bruised
engines.
military morale.
He had lost half his army.
But this brief
But he
respite
still
in the
had
valley
Surus.
was a cruel
The elephant
illusion.
became the anchor
damp,
point for a
forgiving
deeply
earth
bruised
was
military
just a brief
morale.
pause between two
But this
different
brief
kinds
respite
of
in the
hell.
valley
The
was a
mountain had
cruel
failed
illusion.
to kill them.
The
Now,
damp, forgiving
it was time
earth
for the humans
was
to
just a
try.
brief pause
The Roman
between
legions
two
were
different
marching
kinds of
north,
hell.
heavily
The
armed,
mountain had failed to
well-fed,
kill them.
and
Now
eager to wipe
it
the
was time for the
exhausted
humans to
Carthaginian
try.
ghosts off
The
face
Roman
of Italy.
legions were marching north,
Surus
heavily
closed his
armed,
heavy eyes,
well-fed,
leaning his
and
battered
eager to
side
wipe
against
the
a massive
exhausted
oak tree.
Carthaginian
The
ghosts
deep,
off the
comforting
face of
silence
Italy.
of the herd was gone forever.
Surus closed his
He was
heavy
a solitary
eyes,
king in a
leaning
foreign
his
land,
battered side
and the
against a
call of
massive
iron
oak
and
tree.
blood was about
The
to
deep,
sound once
comforting
again.
silence of the herd
If you
was
are
gone
lying
forever.
in the quiet warmth
He was a
of your
solitary
room,
king in a foreign
let your
land,
mind drift away
and the
from
call
the
of
jagged,
iron and blood was
vertical
about to
cliffs of
sound
the
once
Alps.
again.
We have
If
descended
you are
into
lying
the
in the quiet
flatlands,
warmth of your
but the
room,
cold has not abandoned
let your
us.
mind drift
It
away
is now
from the
December of
jagged,
218
vertical cliffs of the
BC.
Alps.
The brutal
We have
winter
descended
of
into the
northern Italy
flatlands,
has set in.
but the cold has
Imagine
not
a
abandoned
vast,
us.
flat expanse
It is
of
now
marshy
December
ground,
of 218
bisected by the
BC.
fast-flowing,
The brutal winter
freezing
of northern
waters of the
Italy has
Trebbia
set
River.
in.
A thick,
Imagine a
heavy morning
vast, flat
fog rolls
expanse
across
of
the
marshy
reeds,
ground,
carrying with it a
bisected by the
chilling mix of
fast-flowing,
sleet and
freezing
rain.
waters of the Trebbia
This is
River.
not a landscape
A
for
thick,
glory.
heavy morning
It is a
fog rolls
landscape
across
of
the reeds,
profound,
carrying
numbing
with
misery.
it a chilling mix of
Hannibal
sleet and
Barca,
freezing rain.
a master of
This
psychological
is not a
warfare,
landscape for
has
glory.
orchestrated
It is a
trap.
landscape of
He has
profound,
ordered his men to
numbing
eat a warm
misery.
meal by roaring
Hannibal
fires,
Barca, a
rubbing their
master of
bodies with oil
psychological
to
warfare,
protect against
has
the bitter
orchestrated a
frost.
trap.
Then
He has ordered his men
sends
to
his
eat
light
a warm
cavalry
meal
across
by
the
roaring
river
fires,
to provoke the
rubbing their
Roman
bodies with
legions.
oil
The
to
Romans,
protect against the bitter
arrogant and
frost.
furious,
Then
take the bait.
he sends his
They
light
wade
cavalry across the river to
before
provoke
they have
the
even
Roman
eaten
legions.
breakfast.
The Romans,
Listen to the
arrogant and
terrifying,
furious,
miserable
take
sound
the
of an
bait.
army crossing
They wade
freezing
across the
water.
Trebbia River
It is the
before they
splashing
have
of
even eaten
40,000
breakfast.
men wading
Listen to the
chest-deep into a
terrifying,
river
miserable
fed
sound
by
of an
mountain
army
snowmelt.
crossing freezing water.
The sharp,
It is the
involuntary
splashing of
gasps for
40,000
air
men
as the
wading
sub-zero
chest
water
deep into a
violently
river
constricts
fed by
their
mountain
chests.
snowmelt.
The heavy,
the
metallic
sharp,
clattering of their
involuntary
soaked
gasps
chainmail
for air
and wet leather
as the
sandals
sub-zero
as they
water
finally drag
violently
themselves onto the
constricts
muddy
their chests.
Carthaginian bank.
The heavy,
They are
metallic
freezing.
clattering of their
They are
soaked
starving,
chainmail and
and
wet
they are
leather
marching
sandals
directly
as they
into a
finally
slaughter.
drag
But
themselves
we are
onto
not
the
here
muddy
to focus on the
Carthaginian
tactical
bank.
genius
They
of
are
men.
freezing.
We are
They
here
are
to look
starving,
through the heavy,
and they are marching
exhausted eyes
directly
of
into a
Surus.
slaughter.
He
But we are
stands
not
in the
here to
heavy
focus
fog,
on the tactical
positioned on the
genius of
flanks
men.
of the Carthaginian
We are here to
infantry.
look through the heavy,
The freezing
exhausted
sleet is
eyes
actively
of
turning
Surus.
into a thin layer
He
of
stands
ice
in the heavy
on the
fog,
rusted iron
positioned
plates
on the flanks
strapped
of
to
the
his belly.
Carthaginian infantry.
The deep, infected
The freezing
grooves
sleet
cut
is
into his
actively
shoulders
turning
by
into
the
a thin
deformed
layer
leather
of
belt,
ice on the
throbbed with
rusted
a dull,
iron plates
rhythmic agony.
strapped to his belly.
He is so tired
the deep,
that his
infected
massive head
grooves
droops.
cut into his shoulders
His one
by the
remaining
deformed leather
bronze-capped
belts
tusk
throb with
resting
a dull,
heavily in the
rhythmic
freezing
agony.
mud.
He is
Then
so tired
the battle
that his
begins.
massive head droops.
It does
his
not
one
start
remaining
with a heroic
bronze-capped
clash.
tusk
It
resting
begins
heavily
with a
in the
sudden,
freezing
deafening
mud.
wall of noise.
Then the battle
guttural
begins.
screaming of tens of thousands
It does
of
not
men,
start with a
the
heroic
piercing
clash.
shrieks of
It
the
begins
Celtic
with a
war
sudden,
horns,
deafening
and the
wall of
rhythmic,
noise,
terrifying
the guttural
banging
screaming
Roman
of tens of
swords against
thousands of
wooden
men,
shields.
the piercing
For an
shrieks of
animal
the
with
Celtic
hearing
war
as
horns,
sensitive as an
and the
elephant,
rhythmic,
this
terrifying
noise is a
banging of
physical
Roman
assault.
swords against
The sheer
wooden
volume
shields.
vibrating through the dense,
For an animal
wet
with
air
hearing as
triggers
sensitive
a
as
violent
an
surge
elephant,
of adrenaline
this noise
in
is a
Surus's
physical
depleted
assault.
body.
The sheer
The
volume
mahout,
vibrating
sitting on
through
his
the dense,
frostbitten
wet
neck,
air
violently
triggers a
strikes the
violent
bronze
surge of
hook
adrenaline
behind his ear.
in Surus's
The signal is
depleted
given.
body.
The
The
giant must
mahout,
move.
sitting on his frostbitten
Surus
neck,
lunges forward.
violently
His
strikes the
massive,
bronze
cracked
hook
feet
behind his
plunge
ear.
deep into the
The
freezing
signal is
Italian
given.
mud,
The giant
tearing
must
up
move.
thick chunks of earth
Surus
and frozen
lunges
grass.
forward. His massive,
History
cracked
records the
feet
sheer
plunge
terror
deep
of
into
the
the
Roman
freezing
legions in
Italian
that
mud,
moment.
tearing
As
up
the
thick
thick
chunks of
morning fog
earth
parted,
and frozen
they
grass.
saw towering dark
History
silhouettes
records the
emerging from
sheer
the mist.
terror of the
They saw
Roman
the gleam
legions
of
in that
rusted
moment.
iron armor
As the
and
thick morning fog parted, they saw towering, dark silhouettes emerging from the mist. They saw the gleam of rusted iron armor and the swinging of massive, scarred trunks. The Roman horses, catching the alien, overwhelming scent of the African beasts,
Roman cavalry
went completely mad.
Before a single
They
spear
reared
was
up,
even thrown.
violently throwing their riders into the freezing mud,
of the
shattering the disciplined Roman cavalry lines before a single spear was even thrown.
Engines of destruction.
Roman historians would later write of the Carthaginian elephants as demonic war machines,
irony of that
unyielding engines of
Those heavily
destruction
armed Roman
that crushed the spirit of the
elite
Republic.
defenders of the
But
greatest
history
civilization
rarely
in the
records
world
the heartbreaking
were running
irony
for their
of that
lives
moment.
from a creature that,
Those heavily
on the
armed
inside,
Roman soldiers,
was shivering,
the elite defenders of
terrified,
the greatest
and
civilization
profoundly
in the
exhausted.
world, were running for their
Surus
lives
was
from
not
a creature
charging out
that,
of martial
on the
pride.
inside,
He was not
shivering
fighting for the glory
terrified,
of a distant city
and
in North
profoundly
Africa.
exhausted.
He was reacting to
Surus
pure,
was not charging out of
agonizing
martial
panic.
pride.
He crashed
He was
into
not
the Roman
fighting for the
infantry
glory
lines
of a distant
because
city
there were
in
men
North
screaming
Africa.
in front of him.
He was reacting
and a
to
sharp
pure,
bronze hook
agonizing
tearing
panic.
into the back of
He
his neck.
crashed into the Roman infantry
Listen
lines
to the surreal,
because there were
heavy
men
violence
screaming
of his
in front of
charge.
him, and
It
a
is not
sharp
swift.
bronze hook
It is
tearing into the
agonizingly
back of his
slow
neck.
and brutally heavy.
Listen to the
sickening
surreal,
crunch
heavy
of a
violence
Roman
of his
wooden
charge.
shield, splintering
It is not
like
swift.
dry twigs
It
beneath
is
his
agonizingly
freezing foot.
slow and
The dull
brutally
metallic
heavy.
thud of a
The
thrown
sickening
Roman
crunch of a
pylon,
Roman wooden
a
shield,
heavy javelin,
splintering like
bouncing
dry twigs
harmlessly
beneath
off the
his
thick
freezing
layer of
foot.
ice,
The
and
dull
rusted iron
metallic
on his
thud
flank.
of a thrown Roman
Surus
pylon,
lets out a trumpet,
a heavy javelin,
but it is not the
bouncing
magnificent,
harmlessly off the thick
earth-shaking
layer
roar
of ice
a wild
and
Syrian
rusted
bull,
iron on his flank.
asserting his dominance
Surus
on the
lets
savannah.
out a trumpet.
It is a hollow,
but it is not the
raspy,
magnificent,
desperate shriek.
earth-shaking
The
roar
sound
of a
torn
wild
lungs
Syrian
and
bull,
frostbitten vocal
asserting
cords
his dominance
tearing
on the
through the freezing
savannah.
fog.
It is a
It
hollow,
is a sound of
raspy,
pure agony.
desperate shriek.
He wildly
The sound of
swings
torn
his heavy
lungs
head,
and frostbitten
using
vocal
his broken
cords,
tusks as a
tearing
blunt
through the
instrument,
freezing fog.
swatting away
It is a
the
sound
tiny,
of pure
two-legged
agony.
creatures.
He
stabbing
wildly
at his
swings
legs.
his heavy head,
He doesn't want
using
to kill
his
them.
broken
He
tusk
just
as a
wants
blunt
the noise
instrument
to stop.
swatting
He just
away the
wants to find
tiny,
a quiet
two-legged
place to close
creatures
his eyes.
stabbing at his
But
legs.
the noise does not
He doesn't
stop
want to
until
kill
the
them.
mud of the
He just
Trebia
wants the
is
noise to
entirely
stop.
soaked in blood.
He just wants to
And the
find a
Roman
quiet
army is
place to
completely
close his
broken,
eyes. But
fleeing
the
back
noise does
across
not
the
stop
freezing
until the
river.
mud of the Trebia
When the
is
slaughter
entirely
finally
soaked
ceases,
in blood.
the
And the
silence
Roman
that
army
falls
is
over the
completely
valley
broken,
is heavy
fleeing
and
back
unnatural.
across the freezing
The Battle
river.
of Trebia is
When
a
the
crushing,
slaughter finally
historic
ceases,
victory for
the
Hannibal.
silence that falls
His
over
men
the valley
cheer,
is heavy
looting the
and
corpses
unnatural.
of the fallen Romans.
The Battle of Trebia
finding
is a
warmth in the
crushing,
cloaks of dead
historic
enemies.
victory for Hannibal.
But
His
Surus
men
simply
cheer,
stops. He
looting
does
the
not
corpses
celebrate.
of the fallen
He
Romans,
stands amidst the carnage,
finding warmth
his
in the
massive
cloaks
sides
of dead
heaving.
enemies.
A thick cloud of
But
white
Surus
steam
simply
pouring
stops.
from his scarred
He does
trunk.
not celebrate.
The adrenaline
He stands
rapidly
amidst the
leaves his
carnage,
bloodstream.
his massive
and the crushing,
sides heaving.
familiar
A
weight
thick
of
cloud of
exhaustion
white
and cold
steam pouring
slams
from his
back
scarred
into his
trunk.
bones.
The adrenaline rapidly
slowly
leaves his
lowers his
bloodstream,
head,
and the
resting his
crushing,
trunk in the
familiar
bloody
weight
snow.
of exhaustion
He
and
survived
cold
the mountain.
slams back into
He
his
survived
bones.
the Roman steel.
He
But as
slowly
he looks
lowers
out
his
over the
head,
freezing,
resting his
darkening
trunk in the
Italian
bloody
landscape,
snow.
his
He
deep,
survived the
ancient
mountain.
instincts
He
whisper a
survived the
chilling
Roman
truth.
steel. But as
This
he looks
was only
out
the
over the
beginning.
freezing,
The
darkening
winter was
Italian
far from
landscape,
over, and
his
ahead
deep,
of them
ancient
lay the
instincts
treacherous,
whisper a
rotting
chilling
bogs
truth.
of the Arno River.
This was
A
only the
place that
beginning.
would demand
The
an
winter
even
was
darker,
far from
more
over,
intimate
and ahead of them
sacrifice from the
lay the
giant
treacherous,
and the general
rotting
who rode
bogs
him.
of the Arno River.
If you are lying
a place
there,
that would
warm
demand an
beneath your
even
blankets,
darker,
I
more
want you to
intimate
take a moment
sacrifice
to
from the
appreciate
giant
the feeling
and the
of
general
dry
who
sheets
rode him.
against your skin.
If you are
Because
lying
as the
there,
bitter winter
warm
of
beneath your
218
blankets,
BC
I want you to
slowly
take a
bled into the
moment
damp,
to appreciate the
miserable
feeling of
spring
dry sheets
217
against your
BC.
skin.
The
Because
concept
as the
of
bitter
dryness
winter of 218
completely ceased to
BC
exist for the
slowly bled into the
Carthaginian
damp, miserable
They had
spring of
survived the
217
jagged,
BC,
freezing peaks of the
the
Alps.
concept of
They had
dryness
crushed the Roman
completely
legions
ceased
at
to
Trebia.
exist for the
But
Carthaginian
Hannibal
army.
Barca knew that to
They had
strike at
survived
very
the
heart
jagged,
of Rome,
freezing peaks
he had
of the
to take a
Alps.
route
They had
no
crushed the
sane
Roman
military
legions at
commander would
Trebia.
ever consider.
But Hannibal Barca
led his
knew
exhausted
that to
army
strike
south,
at the very heart of
directly
Rome,
into the Arno
he had
River
to take a
marshes of
route
Etruria.
no sane military
History books
commander
often
would
glaze
ever
over this
consider.
specific march,
He led his exhausted
summarizing
army
it in a
south,
single sentence
directly
about
into
a
the Arno
brilliant
River
flanking
marshes of
maneuver.
Etruria.
But let us strip
History
away
books
the
often
sterile
glaze over
language
this
of military
specific
tactics.
march, summarizing it in a single
water.
sentence about a brilliant
Imagine a
flanking
vast,
maneuver.
seemingly
But let us
endless
strip away the
expanse of
sterile
rotting
language of
vegetation
military
and
tactics.
stagnant,
Let us
freezing
step
water.
into the water.
There is no solid
Imagine
ground
a
here.
vast,
The air
seemingly
is thick,
endless
not with the
expanse
crisp,
of rotting
clean chill of the
vegetation
mountains,
and stagnant,
but with the heavy,
freezing water.
suffocating stench
There is
of
no
decay,
solid ground here.
of dead fish,
The air is thick,
rotting reeds,
not with the crisp,
and methane
clean chill of
bubbling
the
up from
mountains,
the ancient mud.
but with the heavy,
A thick,
suffocating
oppressive
stench
fog
of decay,
clings to the surface
of
the
dead
water,
fish,
trapping
rotting
the damp
reeds,
cold against
and
the
methane
skin.
bubbling up
For
from
4
the
days
ancient
and
mud.
3 nights,
A thick,
the army
oppressive
marched
fog
through this
clings to the
submerged hell.
surface of the water,
And for 4
trapping
days
the
and 3
damp
nights,
cold against
they
the never once found a piece of dry land and 3 nights. The army marched through this submerged hell,
sound of this march,
and for 4 days and 3 nights, they never once found a piece of dry land to sleep on.
Splash of thousands of
Listen
men
to the grueling, maddening sound of this
muddy
march.
water.
It was a relentless, rhythmic
exhausted
nightmare.
thrashing of horses,
the heavy, wet splash of thousands of men wading waist deep in freezing, muddy water.
There was the mud itself.
The desperate, exhausted thrashing of horses, trying to find their footing in the submerged muck.
It creates a powerful
and then
vacuum.
there was the mud
Every time
itself.
a soldier took a step,
swamp mud
the
is
mud
not
would
like
suck
dirt.
at his feet.
It is a living,
deep,
greedy
grotesque
thing.
squelch,
It creates a powerful
demanding
vacuum.
a massive toll of
Every
physical
time a
energy
soldier took a step,
just to lift a
the mud
single
would
leg.
suck at his feet.
When exhaustion
with a
finally
deep,
overtook
grotesque
them,
squelch,
men simply collapsed
demanding
into
a
the
massive
water
toll
and
of
drowned.
physical energy.
Others tied
just to
themselves
lift
to
a
the
single
bloated
leg.
corpses of their
When
dead
exhaustion
pack
finally
animals,
overtook them,
just to have something
men
buoyant
simply collapsed
to rest
into the
their
water
chins
and
on,
drowned.
so they could
Others
close their
tied
eyes
themselves
for a
to
few
the
minutes
bloated corpses
without
of their
swallowing
dead
the
pack
foul
animals.
water.
just to have something
Now,
buoyant
look at
to rest
Surus.
their chins on,
For a
so
creature
they could
weighing
close their
thousands of
eyes for a
pounds,
few minutes
a swamp
without
is a death
swallowing
trap.
the foul water.
The immense weight that had anchored
Now,
him against the
look at
Alpine
Surus.
blizzards was
For
now
a creature
dragging
weighing
him down
thousands
into
of
the
pounds,
earth.
a
Every
swamp
step
is a
he
death
took
trap.
required
The
a
immense weight
monumental,
that had anchored him against
agonizing
the Alpine
explosion of
blizzards
muscular force.
was now dragging
He
him
would
down
plunge
into
his
the
massive
earth.
front leg into
Every
the dark
step he
water,
took
feeling it
required a
sink deep
monumental,
past his knees,
agonizing
past his
explosion of
elbows,
muscular force.
into the freezing sludge.
He would plunge his massive
Then,
front leg
he had
into
to
the dark
heave his
water,
entire body
feeling
forward,
it sink deep
tearing his
past
limb
his
free
knees,
from the suction
past his
with a
elbows,
sickening,
into the
wet,
freezing
tearing
sludge.
sound.
Then, he had to
rusted
heave his
iron
entire
armor
body
strapped to his
forward,
belly,
tearing
the
his
same
limb
armor
free
that had
from the
frozen to
suction
his
with a
skin in the
sickening,
Alps,
wet,
was now
tearing
entirely
sound.
submerged in the acidic,
The rusted
rotting
iron
water
armor
of the
strapped
marsh.
to his belly,
The heavy
the
wooden
same armor
tower
that
on
had
his
frozen
back
to his skin in
swayed
the Alps,
violently with every
was now
laboured
entirely
lunge.
submerged
The wet
in the
leather
acidic,
straps cutting
rotting
deeper
water
and
of the
deeper
marsh.
into his infected
The heavy
shoulders.
wooden tower on his back
If any other
swayed
elephants had
violently with every
miraculously
laboured
survived
lunge.
the Battle of
The
Trebia,
wet leather straps
this is where
cutting
their
deeper
journey
and
ended.
deeper into his
They
infected
simply sank
shoulders.
into the mud.
If
Their
any other
hearts giving
elephants
out
had
from the
miraculously
sheer,
survived the Battle of
incomprehensible
Trebia,
effort of
this is
moving.
where their journey
But
ended.
Surus kept
They
walking.
simply sank into
He
the
was
mud,
now,
their hearts
unequivocally,
giving out from the sheer,
absolute last of his kind in
incomprehensible
Europe.
effort of moving.
A solitary giant
But
wading
Surus
through
kept
a sea
walking.
of human misery.
He was now,
And upon his
unequivocally,
broad, aching
the
back
absolute
sat a
last
man
of his
who was
kind
also
in Europe.
breaking down.
A solitary giant
Hannibal
wading
Barca
through
had
a
ridden
sea of
horses
human
his
misery.
entire life.
And upon
But
his
in the deep
broad,
waters of
aching
the
back
Arno,
sat
the
a man
horses
who
were
was
drowning.
also breaking down.
The only living thing
Hannibal
tall enough
Barca
to
had
keep
ridden
the
horses his
Carthaginian
entire
commander
life,
above the
but in the
freezing
deep waters of the Arno,
was the
the
Syrian
horses
bull.
were drowning.
But the
The
swamp
only
is
living thing
impartial
tall
in its
enough to
cruelty.
keep the Carthaginian
The foul,
commander above the
bacteria-ridden
freezing waterline
combined with
was
the
the
severe
Syrian
lack
bull.
of sleep, and
But
the
the
biting
swamp
cold
is
winds
impartial in its
triggered
cruelty.
a violent infection
The foul,
in Hannibal's
bacteria-ridden
right eye,
water,
ophthalmia.
combined with the severe
Try
lack
to
of
imagine
sleep
the physical
and the
agony of
biting
that
cold
infection.
winds,
A
triggered
deep,
a violent
throbbing
infection
pressure
in
building
Hannibal's right
mercilessly
eye,
behind the optic nerve.
ophthalmia.
The eye
Try to
swelling
imagine
shut,
the physical
weeping
agony
thick,
of that infection.
burning tears of
A
pus
deep,
and blood.
throbbing pressure
Surrounded
building
by tens
mercilessly
of
behind the
thousands of
optic
dying
nerve.
men.
The
The
eye
great
swelling
general
shut,
could do
weeping
absolutely
thick,
nothing
burning
but
tears
grip
of
the
pus
wooden
and
railings
blood.
of the howdah,
Surrounded by
trembling
tens of
violently
thousands
from
of
a
dying
raging
men,
fever,
the great
and
general
slowly
could
go
do
blind in
absolutely
one eye.
nothing but
There
grip
is a
the wooden
profound,
railings of the
almost
howdah,
poetic
trembling
tragedy
violently
in the
from a
visual
raging
tableau
fever,
of this moment,
and slowly go
a slow,
blind in one
agonizing
eye.
procession through
There
the
is a
fog.
profound,
The man who
almost
sought to
poetic
conquer the
tragedy
world
in
was
the
now
visual
reduced to a
tableau of this
shivering,
moment. A
half-blind
slow,
invalid,
agonizing
entirely
procession
dependent
through the
on the
fog.
beast he had
The
enslaved.
man who sought to conquer
And
the
beast,
world was now
scarred,
reduced to a
starving,
shivering,
and stripped of his
half-blind
herd,
invalid,
had become
entirely
the solitary
dependent
pillar
on the beast he
holding
had
up the weight
enslaved,
of an entire
and the
empire.
beast,
A one-eyed
scarred,
general
starving,
riding upon a
and stripped of his
one-tusked
herd,
elephant.
had
Both
become
of
the
them were
solitary
ruined
pillar
masterpieces.
holding up the weight of
Both
an
of them
entire
carried the
empire.
deep,
A
physical
one-eyed
scars
general
of an
riding
ambition
upon a
that had
one-tusked
pushed them
elephant.
far beyond the natural
Both of them were
limits of
ruined
flesh and bone.
masterpieces.
Surus
Both of them
did
carried
not
the
hate
deep,
the man on his
physical
back.
scars of
In
an
the profound
ambition
silence
that had
of the
pushed them
beast's
far
mind,
beyond the
there was
natural
no
limits
room
of
for
flesh and
complex
bone.
human emotions like
Surus
revenge or
did not hate
resentment.
the man on his back.
There was only the
in the
primal,
profound silence of the
enduring
beast's
will
mind
to survive
there was
the
no
next
room
step.
for complex human
He could feel
emotions
the
like
erratic,
revenge or
feverish
resentment.
trembling of the
There was
human
only the
through
primal,
the heavy wooden planks
enduring
of the
will
tower.
to survive
He could
the
smell
next
the
step.
sickness radiating
He
from
could
the
feel
general,
the erratic,
and in a
feverish
strange,
trembling
twisted
of the
way,
human
they were
through the
bound
heavy
together
wooden
by the
planks
mud.
of the tower.
They were two
He could
solitary
smell the
kings,
sickness radiating
isolated
from the
by their
general,
own unique
and in a
forms of
strange,
suffering,
twisted way,
moving blindly
they were
through a
bound
world
together
that
by
was
the
trying
mud.
to swallow them
They were
whole.
two solitary kings,
The deep, heavy squelch
isolated
of
by their
Surus's
own unique
footsteps
forms of
became
suffering,
the only metronome
moving
of hope
blindly
for the
through a
drowning
world
army.
that was trying to swallow
As long
them
as the
whole.
giant Syrian
The
bull
deep,
kept
heavy
moving
squelch
forward,
of Surus's
tearing
footsteps
his legs from
became the
greedy
only
grip
metronome
the
of
earth.
hope for the
The
drowning
men behind
army.
him would force
As
themselves
long as
to
the
take
giant
one more
Syrian
step.
bull kept moving forward,
Let the slow,
tearing
heavy
his
rhythm of
legs
that
from the
march
greedy grip
sink
of the
into your
earth,
mind.
the men behind
Feel
him
the
would
deep,
force
exhausted
themselves to take
breathing of
one
the
more
elephant.
step.
The cold
Let
water
the slow,
washing against
heavy
his
rhythm
rough
of that
skin.
march sink
The
into
slow,
your mind.
Patient endurance
Feel
of a
the
creature
deep, exhausted breathing of the elephant.
to stop walking.
The cold water washing against his rough skin.
The profound
The
emptiness
slow,
of the soul.
patient endurance
When the
of a creature
Carthaginian army
who simply
finally dragged
refuses to
themselves
stop
out
walking.
of the Arno marshes,
But walking does not
discovering
cure the
solid,
profound
dry
emptiness
ground
of
in
the
the
soul.
rolling hills of
When the
Etruria,
Carthaginian
the
army
true,
finally dragged
devastating
themselves
weight
out
of
of
the
the
journey
Arno marshes,
finally settled
discovering
upon the giant.
solid, dry
It was not
ground
the
in the
physical
rolling
weight
hills
of
of
the
Etruria.
Etruria.
The
It
true,
was the crushing,
devastating weight of the
suffocating weight
journey
of absolute
finally
isolation.
settled upon the giant.
If you are
It was not
lying
the
in the
physical
quiet
weight of the
your
wooden
room,
tower.
I want you to try
It
and
was the
comprehend
crushing, suffocating
terrifying
weight of
reality his
absolute
existence
isolation.
in this very moment.
If you are
In
lying in the
wild,
quiet of your
an
room,
elephant without a
I want you
herd
to try and
is a
comprehend
ghost.
the
They are
terrifying
creatures
reality
wired
of
by
his
millions
existence
of
in
years
this
of
very
evolution
moment.
for
In
deep,
the wild,
constant,
an elephant
and
without a
intricate social
herd
connection.
is a ghost.
Their entire
They are
sense of
creatures
self,
wired by
their
millions
safety,
of years of
and their
evolution
sanity
for
are
deep,
inextricably
constant,
linked to the
and
massive
intricate
bodies
social
that walk
connection.
beside them.
Their entire sense of self,
standing on the
their
edge
safety,
of a foreign,
and their sanity
forest,
are inextricably
Surus
linked to
is
the massive
entirely
bodies
alone.
that walk beside them.
He is the only
But
living
here,
Syrian bull
standing on the edge of a
entire
foreign,
Italian
darkened
peninsula,
forest,
a singular,
Surus
misplaced
is entirely
biological
alone.
anomaly.
He is the
surrounded by
only
tens
living
of
Syrian
thousands of
bull
violent,
on the
noisy,
entire Italian
two-legged
peninsula.
creatures.
A singular,
36 other
misplaced
giants
biological
who had shared
anomaly,
his food,
surrounded by
who had
tens
walked
of
trunk to
thousands
tail
of
with him
violent,
across Iberia,
noisy,
who had
two-legged
bled
creatures.
with him in the snows
The
of the
36
Alps,
other giants
and who had drowned
had shared
in the
his
freezing
food,
swamps,
who had
are all
walked
gone.
trunk to tail with
Their
him
bones
across
are scattered
Iberia,
across
who
1,000
had bled
miles
with
of
him in the
hostile
snows of
territory.
the Alps, and
Listen
who had
to the
drowned in
slow,
the freezing
heartbreaking
swamps,
sounds of his
are all
evening
gone.
ritual.
Their
The
bones
human
are scattered
camp
across
around him is
1,000
bustling.
miles of hostile
Exhausted
territory.
soldiers are desperately
Listen to the
trying to light
slow,
fires
heartbreaking
with damp
sounds
wood.
of his evening
You can
ritual.
hear the rhythmic
The
striking
human
of flint,
camp around him
the
is
low,
bustling.
hoarse whispers of
Exhausted
men boiling
soldiers
bitter
are
roots
desperately
in
trying to
stolen
light
bronze
fires
pots,
with damp
and
wood.
the sharp coughing
You can
of
hear the
sick.
rhythmic striking
But
of flint,
Surus ignores
the
all
low,
of it.
hoarse
He
whispers of
stands at the
men
very
boiling
edge of the
bitter roots
firelight,
in stolen
where the
bronze
shadows
pots,
of the Italian
and the
oaks
sharp
bleed
coughing
into
of
the
the sick.
darkness.
But
His
Surus
physical
ignores all of
deterioration
it.
is
He stands
absolute.
at the very edge
The
of the
foul,
firelight,
acidic water of
where
the
the
swamp
shadows of the
has
Italian
completely
oaks
washed
bleed
away
into the
protective
darkness.
layer of red
His
mud
physical
he had applied to
deterioration
his
is
skin months
absolute.
ago in
The
Africa.
foul,
His
acidic
hide
water
is
of the
terribly
swamp
cracked,
has completely
weeping
washed
clear
away the
fluid from
protective
deep
layer of
fissures.
red mud
The
he
rusted
had
iron
applied to his
plates on his
skin
ribs
months
hang
ago in
loosely
Africa.
by rotting
His
leather
hide
threads,
is terribly
clinking
cracked,
softly against
weeping
his
clear
exposed
fluid
hip
from
bones
deep
with
fissures.
every laboured
The
breath.
rusted iron plates on
Slowly,
his ribs hang
deliberately,
loosely by
he lifts
rotting
his
leather
heavy,
threads,
frost-scarred
clinking
trunk.
softly against his
He extends
exposed
it
hip
toward the
bones with
thick,
every
rough
laboured
bark
breath.
of an ancient oak
Slowly,
tree.
deliberately,
He taps the wood
he
gently.
lifts his heavy,
He is
frost-scarred
searching.
trunk.
He is
He
desperately
extends it
inhaling
toward
the
the
damp,
thick, rough
evening
bark
air,
of an ancient
filtering
oak tree.
millions of
He taps
microscopic
the wood
scent
gently.
particles through his
He is
highly
searching.
sensitive nasal
He is
cavities.
desperately inhaling
He is
the
looking
damp
for a
evening
ghost.
air,
He is looking
filtering
for the
millions of
familiar,
microscopic
earthy
scent
musk of
particles
the younger bull
through his highly
who used to
sensitive
march
nasal
just
cavities.
behind him.
He is
He is
looking for a
searching for the
ghost.
warm, dusty
He is looking
smell
for
of
the
the savannah,
familiar,
or
earthy
even just
musk
the
of the
lingering
younger
scent
bull
of another
who
creature
used to
that
march
speaks his
just
silent
behind
language.
him. He is searching
But the
for the
Italian
warm,
wind
dusty
offers him
smell of the
absolutely
savannah,
nothing.
or even
There
just
is
the
only the
lingering
bitter
scent
scent
of
of
another
wet ash
creature that
blowing off
speaks
the
his silent
campfires,
language.
the sharp,
But the
metallic
Italian
tang of
wind
his own
offers him
rusted armor,
absolutely nothing.
and the heavy,
There is only the
sickening
bitter
smell
scent of
dry
wet
blood
ash
and
blowing off the
gangrene
campfires,
that clings
the sharp,
permanently to the
metallic tang
Carthaginian
of his own
encampment.
rusted armor,
The void in
and
the
the
air
heavy,
is absolute.
sickening smell
It is
of
a
drying
sterile,
blood and gangrene
alien atmosphere
that clings
that
permanently
confirms
to
his
the
worst,
Carthaginian
most
encampment.
primal fear.
The void in the air is
And then
absolute.
a sound
It is a
begins to
sterile,
build deep
alien
within his
atmosphere
massive chest.
that confirms his
It is
worst,
not the frantic,
most
high-pitched
primal
trumpet
fear.
of a military charge.
And then
It is not a roar
sound
of anger
begins to build
against the humans
deep
who
within
brought
his
him
massive
here.
chest.
It is a slow,
It is not the frantic,
rhythmic,
high-pitched trumpet of a
subsonic
military
vibration.
charge.
It
It is not a
so
roar of
incredibly
anger
low
against
that
the
human
humans who brought
soldiers
him
sitting
here.
just a dozen
It
yards
is a
away
slow,
cannot even hear
rhythmic,
it. They can only
subsonic
feel it.
vibration.
It
It starts
manifests
so
as a
incredibly
strange,
low that the
unsettling
human
tremor
soldiers sitting just a
vibrating
dozen
through the
yards
muddy
away
earth,
cannot even
passing
hear it.
through the soles
They
of
can
their
only
leather
feel
sandals
it.
and
It
rattling the
manifests
small
as a
stones
strange,
around their campfires.
unsettling tremor vibrating
It is the
through the
deep,
muddy earth,
ancient acoustic
passing through the
frequency
soles of
that
their leather
elephants use to
sandals
call out to
and
their
rattling the
families
small
across
stones around their
vast,
campfires.
insurmountable distances.
It is the
A
deep,
desperate,
ancient
seismic
acoustic
plea for
frequency
connection.
that elephants use to
Surus
call out to their
closes his
families
eyes.
across
He
vast,
anchors his massive
insurmountable
feet into the
distances.
dirt and
A
pours the
desperate,
absolute
seismic
last
plea
reserves
for
of his
connection.
fading strength
Surus
into that
closes his
vibration.
eyes.
He sends
He
the
anchors
heavy
his
rolling
massive
sound
feet into
waves
the
out
dirt
into the darkening
and pours
valley.
the absolute
The
last
invisible
reserves
tremor
of his
rolls
fading
over the
strength
rolling hills of
into that
Etruria,
vibration.
passing
He
through
sends
the
the
dense
heavy
pine
rolling
forests,
sound waves out into
skimming
the
across the
darkening
surface
valley.
of the freezing
The
rivers,
invisible tremor
and
rolls
fading
over the
out into
rolling
the
hills of
hostile Roman
Etruria,
landscape.
passing through the
And
dense
then
pine forests.
he waits,
skimming across the
He keeps
surface
his
of the
massive,
freezing rivers,
ruined ears
and fading
perfectly
out
still,
into the hostile
straining
Roman
against
landscape.
the quiet rustle of the
And
night.
then,
Listening
he
with
waits.
every fibre of his
He
being
keeps his
for the
massive,
faint,
ruined
answering
ears
rumble of
perfectly
his
still,
family.
straining
He waits for
against the
ground
quiet
to answer
rustle
back.
of the night.
He waits
listening
for a
with
sign
every
that he has
fibre
not
of his
been
being
entirely
for the
abandoned
faint,
by the universe.
answering rumble of his family.
But no answer
He waits for the
comes.
ground around to answer back.
The earth remains
he waits for a
completely,
sign that he has not been entirely
still.
abandoned by the universe.
The only response he receives
but no
is
answer
the indifferent, hollow
the earth
whistling
remains
of the wind
completely,
moving through
devastatingly
the alien
still.
oak leaves. The only
For the
response
first
he
time in
receives
his long,
is the
brutal
indifferent, hollow
absolute
whistling of the
truth of
wind
his situation
moving through the
crashes
alien
down
oak
upon
leaves.
him. There is no
For the
one
first
left to hear
time in
him.
his
The
long,
invisible
brutal life,
subsonic web
the
that had
absolute
connected
truth
him
of
to
his
the world since
situation
the day he was
crashes
born
down
has
upon
been
him.
completely
There is no
and
one left to
permanently
hear
severed.
him.
The invisible, subsonic web that had connected him to the world since the day he was born has been completely and permanently severed. His massive legs tremble. The herd is dead. Slowly, the home is gone. His heavy head. The giant Syrian bull lets out a long, shuddering exhale. Soil. His massive legs tremble. Slowly, he lowers his heavy head until his broken tusk rests against the damp Italian soil. His spirit. He closes his heavy, unforgiving world of men. And in the profound, crushing silence of the night, he finally surrenders his spirit to the lonely, unforgiving world of men and our monsters. History is deeply obsessed with exactly where the sword fell. As humans, where the final breath demand grand finales and how the dust settled on the battlefield and our monsters. But for Surus, we want to know exactly where the sword fell, where the final breath was drawn, and how the dust settled on the battlefield or Rome. But for Surus, simply the solitary giant of Syria, after the there is no dramatic final chapter written in the scrolls of Carthage or Rome. He simply the colossal silhouette of the after the agonizing, muddy hell of Etruria, into the thick, after the blinding, bloody fog of Lake Trasimene, did he finally the colossal silhouette of the one-tusked elephant tearing slowly dissolves into the thick, his massive unresolved exhausted from carrying the unfathomable did he finally succumb to the deep, weeping infections tearing at his shoulders? Did his massive heart, or did he fall exhausted from carrying the unfathomable weight of a foreign empire, surrounded by the simply stop beating in the middle of a quiet Italian night? Or did he fall months later on the blood-soaked plains of Cannae, surrounded by the deafening roar of a slaughter he never understood? Think about the profound emptiness swallowed the answer, leaving behind only the heavy, indifferent silence of the passing centuries. Think about the profound emptiness of that silence. The men who drove him with sharp bronze hooks, Hannibal Barca, the generals who plotted in their woolen tents, ruthless military the Roman emperors who feared the heavy thud of his footsteps. They are eventually all gone. Drank poison. Hannibal Barca, in a lonely, the brilliant, exile, ruthless military genius iron chains who forced a freezing mountain to yield. Invincible Roman eventually drank poison elite legions in a lonely, bitter exile before Surus to escape the iron chains of Rome. Eventually, the seemingly invincible Roman Republic, whose elite legions trembled and broke before Surus's cracked, frozen feet, eventually crumbled into dust. Its magnificent marble temples reduced to ivy-choked ruins. It all eventually surrendered to the quiet, slow, all that spilled blood, power of the all the frantic, shouting ambition of the ancient world. It all eventually surrendered to the quiet, the massive, undefeated power of the dirt. Syrian bull, somewhere beneath the rolling, peaceful green vineyards of modern-day Italy. The massive, ancient fossilized bones of a Syrian bull lie buried deep in the dark, bitter winter winds. Still the thick, through the silent roots of ancient olive trees wrap gently around his shattered tusk. The same bitter winter winds still howl through the jagged alpine passes suffocating wooden tower, but they can no longer touch him. The blinding snow. The frost can no longer bite at his ears. The deep, silent he is finally free from the heavy, suffocating wooden tower. Listening to the quiet rhythm of the night in your room. He has returned to the deep, silent earth from which he came. Let the air if you are still awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of the night in your room, imagine releasing I want you to take a deep, invisible final breath. Chains of your own Let the air fill your lungs completely. We all carry our own and as you exhale, imagine releasing the heavy, blinding, invisible iron chains of your own daily battles. Cannot control. We all carry our own wooden towers. Of Surus we all march through our own blinding blizzards, pushed forward by pressures we sometimes cannot control. But the forgotten story of Surus is a gentle, melancholic reminder that absolutely everything but fleeting shadows, our greatest fears, our heaviest burdens, and our most frantic ambitions will eventually pass. They are nothing but fleeting shadows cast against the vast, quiet canvas of time. Just as the giant once did. It is time to stop marching. It is time to unburden your shoulders and lay your heavy head down, chaotic, just as the giant once did. In the damp Italian grass, of Surus guide let your mind drift away from the frozen peaks and the chaotic, sound is the muddy battlefield of dry palm leaves. Let the ancient spirit of Surus guide you back to a warm, sun-drenched savannah, surrender to the where the only sound is the gentle rustling of dry palm leaves and the slow, peaceful breathing of the military genius. Close your eyes, surrender to the quiet. Eventually drank poison in a lonely, bitter exile to escape the iron chains of Rome.